The evening air hung heavy over the quiet suburban streets, a stillness broken only by the low hum of a patrol car's engine cutting through the dusk. Ethan Kane's hands gripped the steering wheel with a ferocity that turned his knuckles ghostly white. His jaw clenched so tight it seemed his teeth might crack under the pressure. 22 years on the force had carved deep lines into his weathered face, but tonight, those lines seemed sharper, etched with a bitterness that pulsed through his every word. Beside him, rookie Ryan Collins sat stiffly, his broad shoulders hunched as if bracing for a storm he could sense, but not yet see. The tension in the car was palpable, a living thing that coiled tighter with every mile they drove. "This department's going to hell," Ethan muttered, his voice a low growl that sliced through the silence like a jagged blade. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, though there was nothing behind them but empty road. First, they bowed to the damn media, kissing up to every bleeding heart with a camera. And now they shove someone like him into the captain's chair. A guy who doesn't even belong here. His words dripped with venom, each syllable a little stab at some unseen enemy. Ryan shifted in his seat, his fingers twitching against the edge of his uniform as he stole a glance at Ethan. The older man's agitation was a storm cloud rolling in, dark and unpredictable, and Ryan felt the first drops of unease prickling at his skin. "Someone like him," he ventured, his voice soft but edged with a quiet challenge. He wasn't sure he wanted the answer, but the question slipped out before he could stop it. Ethan's head snapped toward him, his eyes narrowing into slits that gleamed with something ugly. "You know exactly what I mean, kid," he spat, his tone sharp enough to draw blood. "David Carter. A damn political puppet, that's all he is. They're tossing out decades of real experienced Seagies who've bled for this job just to prop up some poster boy for the headlines." He snorted, a harsh, derisive sound that filled the car like smoke. "It's a disgrace." Ryan's stomach twisted, a slow churn of discomfort that made his palms sweat against his thighs. He'd only been on the force a few months, his badge still shiny and untested. But Ethan's words felt like a poison seeping into the air. "Maybe Carter earned it," he said carefully, picking his words like he was stepping through a minefield. "Maybe he's good at what he does. Shouldn't we at least give him a chance?" Ethan's laugh was a cold, brittle thing, shattering against the dashboard. "Naive. That's what you are, Collins. Green as hell. These people don't belong calling shots. They don't know the streets, not like we do. They don't get the grit, the grind, the way things really work." His voice was a sermon of disdain, preached to an audience of one who wasn't sure he wanted to listen. Before Ryan could muster a reply, Ethan's gaze sharpened, locking onto something ahead. A sleek black sedan glided through the intersection, its polished surface catching the last rays of the fading sun. The car was pristine, its tinted windows reflecting the world in dark, inscrutable panes. Behind the wheel sat a man in a crisp dark suit, his posture straight, his movements deliberate as he eased to a stop at the light. Ethan's lips curled into a sneer. "Well, look at that," he muttered, his tone thick with suspicion, as if the car itself were a confession of guilt. Ryan followed his gaze, his brow furrowing. "What about it?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. The car was clean. The driver composited nothing about it screamed trouble. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing to slits as he studied the sedan like a hunter sizing up prey. "Bet he stole it," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Probably doesn't even have the papers to prove it's his. Guys like him don't roll around in rides like that unless they've got something to hide." Ryan's frown deepened, a flicker of defiance sparking in his chest. "You don't know that," he said, his voice steadier now. "He's not speeding. He's not breaking any laws. What's the problem?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, his hand darted to the dashboard, flipping on the patrol car's lights with a flick of his wrist. The red and blue glow spilled across the road ahead, and the siren's wail tore through the evening calm like a banshee's cry. "Time for a little routine check," he said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as he gunned the engine, closing the distance to the sedan. Ryan's heart thudded against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the flashing lights. "Sir, are you sure this is necessary?" he asked, leaning forward, his voice tight with unease. "He hasn't done anything suspicious. Ethan's glare was a whipcrack, sharp and stinging. "That's why you're the rookie, Collins. Trust me, people like him don't drive cars like that unless they're up to no good. You'll learn." His tone was laced with a condescension that made Ryan's skin crawl. "And if you want to survive in this department, you'd better start following orders." The sedan pulled over smoothly, its driver responding to the lights with a calm precision that only seemed to fuel Ethan's suspicion. Ethan parked the patrol car with a jolt, slamming the gearshift into place with a force that rattled the frame. Ryan hesitated, his eyes fixed on the man in the sedan. Through the tinted glass, he could see the driver's hands tight on the wheel, his posture rigid but composed, a quiet defiance in the set of his shoulders. "Stay here if you're too squeamish," Ethan barked, unbuckling his seatbelt and shoving the door open. He stepped out into the cooling air, his boots hitting the asphalt with a heavy thud. Ryan lingered for a heartbeat, his gut twisting into knots, before following. He couldn't just sit there run it when every instinct screamed that this was wrong. Ethan approached the sedan with a swagger, his hand resting lightly on his holster as if daring the world to give him a reason. The driver's window slid down with a soft whir, revealing a man whose face was a mask of calm, though his dark eyes betrayed a flicker of wariness. "Good evening, officers," he said, his voice steady, measured, like a man who'd learned to keep his emotions on a tight leash. "Is there a problem?" Ethan leaned in close, his breath fogging the edge of the window, license and registration. He demanded, his tone clipped and cold, leaving no room for discussion. The man nodded, moving with deliberate slowness as he reached into the glove compartment. "Of course," he said, his hands steady as he handed over the documents. Ethan snatched them up, his eyes scanning the papers with a predatory intensity. "Devin Carter." He read aloud, his lips twisting into a sneer as if the name itself were an insult. "What brings you to this part of town, Mr. Carter?" "I'm heading to a meeting," Devin replied, his voice even, though his eyes flicked briefly to Ryan, who stood a few paces back, shifting uneasily. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Ethan ignored the question, handing the documents back with a sluggishness that felt deliberate, almost taunting. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, his voice hardening. Devin's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, a shadow of frustration crossing his face. "Step out? On what grounds?" "I said step out," Ethan repeated, his tone rising, a dangerous edge creeping in. Ryan stepped forward, his voice trembling but firm. "Sir, he's complied with everything so far. Maybe we should." "Quiet, rookie," Ethan snapped, his glare cutting through Ryan like a blade. "Let me handle this." The air thickened with tension, a suffocating weight that pressed down on all three men. Devin sighed, a sound heavy with resignation, and opened his door. He stepped out slowly, his movements precise, as if he were walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. Ethan circled the car, his eyes darting over every inch of it, searching for something to think justify what he was doing. "Nice car," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "How does someone like you afford something like this?" Devin's jaw tightened, but his response was calm, measured. "I work hard, officer. Now, can you please explain why you stopped me?" Ethan's hand drifted to his holster again, a subtle threat that hung in the air like a storm cloud. Ryan stepped closer, his voice stronger now. "Sir, he hasn't done anything wrong. Maybe we should let him go." Ethan whirled on him, his face a mask of irritation. "You're starting to get on my nerves, Collins. If you don't have the stomach for this, go wait in the car." Ryan didn't budge, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "This doesn't feel right," he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Ethan waved him off with a dismissive sneer, turning back to Devin. "Mind if I take a look inside?" Devin squared his shoulders, his voice firm. "I do mind. I haven't done anything wrong, and I don't consent to a search." Ethan's expression darkened, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. "Oh, you've got something to hide, don't you?" Before Devin could respond, Ethan yanked the car door open, shoving his head inside without permission. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat of outrage. "Sir, that's illegal," he shouted. Stepping forward, "He didn't give you consent." "Stay out of it, Collins," Ethan barked, his voice echoing off the sedan as he rummaged through the interior. Devon stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, his calm facade cracking under the weight of the violation. Ryan watched, helpless, as the situation spiraled further into chaos, the air thick with the unspoken promise of consequences yet to come. Moments earlier, Devon Carter had been driving with a quiet focus, his hands steady on the wheel of his pristine sedan. The patrol car's flashing lights in his rearview mirror sent a jolt through him, a flicker of unease that tightened his grip. Something about the aggressive way it maneuvered behind him set his nerves on edge. He wasn't speeding, hadn't swerved, hadn't given any reason for this. His mind raced, weighing his options. Pulling over on this empty stretch of road felt like stepping into a trap, so he kept driving, his eyes scanning for a turn that would take him somewhere safer, somewhere with witnesses. Ethan, in the patrol car, slammed his hand against the wheel, his face twisting with fury. "He's running," he snarled, though the sedan's pace remained steady, lawful. Ryan glanced at the speedometer, his brow furrowing. "He's not speeding, sir. He's just heading toward a busier street. Maybe he feels unsafe." Ethan scoffed, his eyes locked on the sedan. "Unsafe? What's he got to be afraid of? He's guilty of something. Watch and learn, rookie." He floored the accelerator, the patrol car surging forward, its siren screaming through the night as it wove through sparse traffic. Devon kept his composure, signaling every turn with meticulous care, refusing to give Ethan an inch of justification. Ahead, he spotted a small commercial street, a scattering of shops and streetlights. Not crowded but far from deserted. It was enough. He signaled again, pulling to the curb with a precision that spoke of a man who knew the stakes. Ethan didn't hesitate, angling the patrol car to block part of the lane before flinging his door open with a force that made the hinges groan. Ryan scrambled to unbuckle, calling after him, "Sir, let's keep this calm." "Stay in the car if you're gonna lecture me," Ethan snapped, his voice a whipcrack as he marched toward the sedan, his hand hovering near his holster. Devon lowered his window as Ethan approached, his expression a careful mask of calm, though his voice carried a steely edge. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Ethan leaned in, his face inches from Devon's, his breath hot and heavy. "License and registration." "Now." Devon nodded, moving slowly to retrieve the documents, his every gesture deliberate. "Here you go," he said, handing them over, his hands steady but his eyes locked on Ethan's, unyielding. Ethan barely glanced at the papers before barking, "Step out of the vehicle." Devon frowned, a flicker of defiance in his gaze. "I've complied with everything. Can you tell me why I was pulled over?" Ethan's lip curled, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "I don't answer questions. Get out of the car." Devon hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced at Ryan, who stood by the patrol car, his discomfort plain. "Is this really necessary?" Devon asked, his tone a quiet challenge. Ethan's eyes flashed with fury. "I set out. Now." With a heavy sigh, Devon unbuckled his seatbelt, the click of the latch echoing in the tense silence. He stepped out, his movements slow and controlled, a man caught in a storm he hadn't asked for. And in that moment, the threads of justice began to unravel, exposing a rot far deeper than any of them could have imagined, a rot that would demand a reckoning, a price for the arrogance of power unchecked. The air was thick with tension as Devon Carter unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of his sleek black sedan, his movements slow and purposeful, as though each step was a silent declaration of his resolve. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his chin lifted just enough to signal defiance without provocation. The late afternoon sun glinted off the car's polished surface, casting sharp reflections onto the cracked pavement of the quiet street. Ethan Kane, the seasoned officer with a reputation that preceded him, emerged from the patrol car a few paces away, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached. His eyes, sharp and predatory, immediately locked onto Devon's vehicle, scanning every curve and crevice of its exterior with the precision of a hawk circling prey. "Nice ride," Ethan muttered, his voice low and laced with a biting sarcasm that seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. "How does someone like you afford something this fancy?" Devon's brow furrowed, a flicker of irritation sparking in his dark eyes, though his face remained a mask of controlled calm. He shifted his weight slightly, planting his feet more firmly on the ground. "Someone like me?" he replied, his tone measured but edged with steel. "I work hard, officer, day in, day out. Is that a problem for you?" His words weren't just a response, they were a quiet assertion. A line drawn in the sand. Ethan didn't bother acknowledging the rebuttal. Instead, he tilted his head toward the trunk, his lips curling into a faint, mocking grin. "Mind popping this open for me?" The question wasn't a request, it was a test. Devon's jaw tightened, his hands flexing briefly at his sides as he wrestled with the urge to let his frustration boil over. "Yes," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the still air like a blade. "I do mind. I haven't done anything wrong, and you've got no probable cause to search my car." His stance was unyielding, his gaze locked onto Ethan's, daring him to push further. Ethan stopped his slow orbit around the vehicle and turned to face Devon head-on, his expression darkening like a storm cloud rolling in. The smirk faded, replaced by something colder, more menacing. "You're refusing to cooperate?" he asked, his voice dropping to a near growl. Devon didn't flinch. "I'm standing up for my rights," he said, his tone steady, resolute, a quiet thunder rumbling beneath his words. Ethan took a step closer, his boots scuffing the pavement, his posture shifting into something aggressive, almost predatory. The space between them shrank, the air crackling with unspoken threats. "You've got something to hide, don't you?" Ethan accused, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in, searching Devon's face for a crack in his composure. From the sidelines, near the patrol car's flickering lights, Ryan Kalin's rookie officer, still finding his footing, watched the exchange unfold. With a growing knot in his stomach, his hands fidgeted nervously at his sides, his uniform feeling too tight, too heavy. He could see the situation teetering on the edge of something dangerous, and his conscience gnawed at him. Finally, he found his voice, though it trembled slightly as he spoke. "Sir, he's been compliant so far. Maybe we should ease up a little." Ethan's head snapped toward Ryan, his glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Stay out of this, Collins," he barked, jabbing a finger in the rookie's direction. "You're here to watch, not to meddle." His words were a whip, meant to sting, and Ryan recoiled slightly, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and unease. Devon caught Ryan's eye for a fleeting moment, and in that glance, there was a flicker of understanding, a shared frustration at the powerlessness they both felt. Ryan's wide, uncertain eyes betrayed his inner turmoil, but it wasn't enough to shift the tide. Ethan turned back to Devon, his smirk creeping back like a shadow. "If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind me taking a quick peek, right?" "I do mind," Devon shot back, his voice rising with a sharp edge. "You don't have the right to search my vehicle without a warrant. You know that." Ethan's smirk widened into something cruel, a glint of triumph dancing in his eyes. "You think that's how this works?" he taunted. Without warning, he yanked the driver's side door open with a force that made the hinges groan, the sound echoing down the empty street. He ducked inside, his hands rifling through the front seat with reckless abandon, tossing aside anything in his path. Devon lurched forward, his breath catching in his throat, his voice swelling with indignation. "Hey, you can't do that." Ryan moved instinctively, his heart hammering against his ribcage as he stepped between the two men, his arms outstretched like a fragile barrier. "Sir, please step back," he said to Devon, though his voice wavered, betraying his nerves. He turned to Ethan, his pulse racing, his words spilling out in a shaky rush. "Officer Kane, this isn't right." He didn't give consent. Ethan didn't even glance up from his search, his hands still tearing through the car's interior. "Go back to the car, rookie," he growled, his tone dripping with disdain. Ryan's stomach twisted into knots as he watched Ethan's blatant disregard for the rules he'd sworn to uphold. The injustice of it burned in his chest, but he felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by indecision. Devon stood just beyond Ryan's outstretched arm, his hands balled into fists at his sides, his breathing shallow but deliberate. He forced himself to stay calm, to keep his anger from erupting, though every muscle in his body screamed for him to act. "You won't find anything," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Because I've done nothing wrong." Ethan ignored him, muttering under his breath. "There's always something." Ryan could feel the situation spiraling. the tension coiling tighter with every passing second. He knew this was wrong, knew it in his bones, but he didn't know how to stop it. His training hadn't prepared him for this, for the moment when justice itself seemed to bend under the weight of one man's arrogance. Finally, Ethan emerged from the car, his posture radiating smug satisfaction. He held up an object Ryan couldn't quite identify from where he stood, his grin widening as he waved it triumphantly. "Let's see where this goes," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. Devon's eyes widened, a flash of shock cutting through his composure. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his tone rising with a mix of disbelief and fury. Ethan pointed to the driver's seat, his expression hardening into something almost gleeful. "Drugs. You've got yourself a nice little stash here, Carter." "That's ridiculous," Devon snapped, his voice cracking with outrage. "I don't do drugs, so don't even drink. You planted that, and you know it." His words hung in the air, heavy with accusation, and Ryan's blood turned to ice. He'd seen Ethan's sleight of hand, the subtle flick of his wrist as he'd slipped a small plastic bag beneath the seat. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to speak, to shout, to do something, but his body wouldn't move. His training urged obedience, but his conscience screamed betrayal. Ethan straightened, his grin morphing into a sneer. "False accusations will only dig you deeper." "Carter," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, drawn by the flashing lights and the escalating voices. The murmur of their whispers grew louder, a few onlookers pulling out their phones, the tiny red lights of their cameras blinking like fireflies in the dusk. Devon turned toward them, his voice booming over the hum of the crowd. "This is a setup. This officer planted evidence in my car's framing me." Ethan's face darkened, his hand twitching toward his handcuffs. "Watch yourself, Carter," he growled. "You're only making this worse." Devon took a step forward, his anger barely contained, his eyes blazing with defiance. "You think you can get away with this, that no one will see what you're doing? There are cameras everywhere, officer. People are watching." Ryan's hands clenched into fists, the weight of Devon's words sinking into him like lead. The crowd's eyes darted between him and Ethan, their murmurs swelling into shouts. "This is wrong," someone yelled. "We're recording everything," another added. Ryan's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He felt trapped, caught between the oath he'd taken and the reality unfolding before him. Ethan ignored the growing unrest, reaching for Devon's arm with a rough grip. "Devon Carter, you're under arrest for possession of narcotics. Hands behind your back." Devon glared at him, his body rigid with defiance. "This is absurd. I've done nothing wrong, and you know it." Ethan stepped closer, the cuffs glinting in his hand. "Resisting arrest now. Go ahead. Give me another reason to haul you in." Ryan's heart pounded, his voice breaking as he finally spoke. "Officer Kane, I need to talk to you. Privately." Ethan didn't turn, his focus locked on Devon. "Later, Collins." "No, sir," Ryan pressed, his voice cracking with urgency. "Now." Ethan spun around, his eyes blazing with incredulity and rage. "What the hell are you doing, rookie? You think this is the time to question me?" Ryan's pulse thundered in his ears, his mind racing. This was a moment that would define him. Before he could respond, Devon's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and unwavering. "Officer Collins, you saw what happened. You know the truth. Are you going to stand there and let this man ruin my life?" Ryan froze, every muscle locking as the weight of Devon's plea crashed over him. Ethan turned back to Devon, his voice dripping with venom. "He's not going to listen to you, Carter. He knows better than to side with a criminal." The crowd's shouts grew louder, their outrage palpable, and Ryan felt their eyes boring into him. Ethan grabbed Devon's arm, wrenching it behind his back with a force that made Devon wince. "Hands behind your head. Now." Devon didn't resist, but his voice remained steady. "This isn't over, officer. Not by a long shot." As Ethan snapped the first cuff into place, Ryan took a shaky step forward, his voice rising above the din. "Sir, I need you to stop." Ethan's head whipped around, his eyes locking onto Ryan's with a fury that could have shattered stone. "Shut your mouth, Collins," he barked, his voice echoing over the commotion. But Ryan's indecision melted away, replaced by a surge of clarity, of anger, of purpose. "This isn't right," he said, louder now, his voice carrying a strength he hadn't known he possessed. Ethan froze, the tension between them crackling like a live wire, the crowd falling silent under the weight of their standoff. In that moment, Ryan's mind raced back to his father's words, spoken years ago over a flickering campfire. "A true officer serves justice, no matter the cost." "You took an oath, son." The memory steadied him, grounding him in the chaos. He took another step forward, his voice trembling but resolute. "Officer Kane, I saw what you did. You planted that evidence. This stops now." Ethan's face twisted with rage, but beneath it, there was something else, a fear, perhaps, or the dawning realization that his power had limits. The crowd erupted, their shouts a chorus of validation, and Ryan stood tall, his choice made. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a line he wouldn't cross, no matter the consequences. For Devon, it was a small victory, a glimmer of hope amidst the violation of his rights. For Ethan, it was a reckoning, a stark reminder that power, when wielded without restraint, could crumble under the weight of its own corruption. And for Ryan, it was a baptism by fire, a lesson carved into his soul. True authority lies not in force, but in the courage to stand against its abuse. The night air buzzed with tension, a restless energy crackling through the growing throng of onlookers, as Ryan Collins raised his voice, cutting through the murmur like a blade. "What the hell are you talking about?" he shouted, his words aimed not just at Ethan Kane, but at the sea of faces now pressing closer, drawn by the unfolding spectacle. His accusation hung heavy in the humid evening, each syllable dripping with conviction. "I saw you, Ethan. You slipped that bag of drugs under the driver's seat. Watched you pull it from your pocket. With my own eyes." A sharp, collective inhale swept through the crowd, a wave of shock rippling outward as dozens of phones lifted higher, their glowing screens capturing every second of the chaos. Devon Carter, his wrists still half-bound by cold steel cuffs, snapped his head toward Ryan. His dark eyes flickered with a storm of emotions, disbelief warring with a fragile spark of hope. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, his breath shallow as he stood there, a man caught between ruin and redemption. For weeks, he'd carried himself with quiet dignity, preparing to step into his new role as precinct captain. But now that dignity trembled under the threat of Ethan's malice. Could this rookie, this untested kid with fire in his voice, really be the one to pull him back from the edge? Ethan Kane's face twisted into a snarl, his features hardening as fury surged through him. "You don't know what you're saying, Collins," he spat, his voice low and venomous, like a predator cornered. The veins in his neck bulged as he took a step forward, his boots scuffing against the asphalt. "You're green, a damn rookie. You don't get how things work out here in the real world." His words were a challenge, a dare laced with the arrogance of a man who'd bent the rules so often he'd forgotten where they began. Inside, though, a flicker of unease gnawed at Himrian's unwavering stare was a mirror he didn't want to face. Ryan didn't flinch. He squared his shoulders, his heart hammering against his ribs as he took another deliberate step forward. The crowd's murmurs swelled around him, a chaotic symphony of disbelief and outrage. But his voice sliced through it all, steady and unshaken. "I know exactly what I saw, Ethan. And it sure as hell wasn't just a sight, was a setup, plain and simple." The words ignited the onlookers, their shouts erupting like sparks, catching dry grass. Phones tilted and zoomed, framing the confrontation in a dozen shaky angles as a voice pierced the din. "He's telling the truth." Bold and anonymous, fueling the fire. Ethan's composure fractured, a crack splitting through the mask he'd worn so confidently. He lunged toward Ryan, closing the distance between them with a stride that radiated menace. His breath was hot and ragged as he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a hiss that only Ryan could hear. "You listen to me, rookie," he growled, his eyes burning with a dangerous glint. "You're making a mistake, a big one. One word against me, and your career's dead before it even starts." The threat lingered in the air, sharp and tangible. But beneath it, Ethan's mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Collins was supposed to fold, not fight. Ryan's jaw tightened, his pulse roaring in his ears, but he held his ground. The weight of Ethan's words pressed against him, tempting him to retreat, to protect the fragile dream of a career he'd barely begun. But then he thought of Devon, of the bag planted with such casual cruelty, and a fire flared in his chest. "If protecting my career means turning a blind eye to this," he said, his voice ringing with defiance, "then it's not worth having. I won't be part of your games, Ethan." The crowd roared its approval, a messy chorus of cheers and jeers. But Ryan barely heard. Ethan's world had narrowed to the man in front of him. Ethan's face contorted with rage, his lips curling back as he loomed over Ryan. "You think you're some kind of hero," he bellowed, his voice rising to drown out the crowd. "You're nothing. Colin's just a wet behind-the-ears kid playing cop," his hands balled into fists, trembling with the urge to lash out, but a part of him faltered. The rookie's resolve was a wall he couldn't break, and the crowd's iced host damn phones were peeling back his authority layer by layer. Devon Carter watched the exchange with a quiet intensity, his broad shoulders squared despite the cuffs biting into his wrists. The chaos swirled around him, but his mind was a still point, calculating every word, every move. When he spoke, his voice cut through Ethan's tirade like a blade through silk. "For a rookie," he said, his tone steady and edged with steel, "he's got more integrity than you'll ever scrape together, Officer Kane." The words were a lifeline tossed to Ryan, but they were also a gauntlet thrown at Ethan's feet, and Devon relished the flicker of doubt he saw in the other man's eyes. Ethan whirled toward Devon, his hand darting to his holster with the speed of instinct. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he barked, his fingers curling around the grip of his gun. The crowd gasped as one, the air thickening with a suffocating tension. Phones zeroed in on Ethan's hand, the glint of metal catching the streetlights as panic rippled through the onlookers. Inside, Ethan's mind churned. It hadn't meant to escalate this far, but pride and desperation had him teetering on a razor's edge. Ryan's heart slammed against his chest, a wild drumbeat urging him to act. He raised his hands slightly, palms open, and stepped between Ethan and Devon, his body a fragile shield. "Sir, put the gun down," he said, his voice louder than he'd thought possible. Firm despite the tremor in his legs, Ethan's eyes flicked between the two men. His rage barely contained storm. "Back off, Collins," he snapped, his grip tightening until his knuckles gleamed white. "You don't know who you're protecting." "I'm protecting the truth," Ryan shot back, his voice steady even as adrenaline flooded his veins. "And right now, you're a danger to everyone here." The crowd's shouts grew frantic. "Drop it." Someone screamed, their voice raw with fear, and the world seemed to tilt. Every breath a countdown to disaster. Ethan's chest heaved as he took a step toward Devon, his intent clear, but Ryan moved faster. He planted himself squarely in the line of fire, his voice thundering through the chaos. "Enough. You pull that trigger and your life's over, sir. Don't make this worse than it already is." For a heartbeat, time froze. Ethan's eyes locked onto Ryan's, searching for a crack, a hint of weakness to exploit. But Ryan stood tall, his gaze unyielding, a rookie transformed by the weight of his choice. "You're done, Kane," he said, his voice dropping to a cold, resolute whisper. "It's over." The words broke something in Ethan's hand slackened, the gun slipping from his grasp as it fell to his side. The crowd erupted, a tidal wave of relief and anger crashing over them as Devon exhaled a breath he hadn't known he'd held. "About damn time," Devon muttered, a wry twist of humor threading through his exhaustion. He met Ryan's eyes with a faint nod, a silent acknowledgement of the rookie's courage. Then he turned to the crowd, his voice rising above the noise. "This man is innocent. What happened here tonight isn't justice, it's a disgrace, and it won't stand." Ethan's voice cut through, seething with venom. "You've ruined yourself, Collins. You'll regret this." Ryan turned to face him, his expression carved from stone. "The only thing I'd regret is letting you get away with it." The crowd surged forward as more officers arrived, their sirens slicing through the night. The tension didn't fade, it morphed, coiling tighter as cameras kept rolling, immortalizing the unraveling drama. Ethan glared at Ryan, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. The rookie had just torched the unspoken code of loyalty, and now every eye was on him, waiting for the next move. Devon, still half-cuffed, stood taller, his presence a quiet command. "You've got guts, rookie," he said, his voice calm but resonant. "I'll give you that." Ethan jabbed a finger at Devon, his control slipping further. "Shut your mouth. You're a criminal. Nothing this kid says changes that." Devon's lips curved into a small, knowing smile, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "You sure about that, Officer Kane?" he asked, his tone deceptively mild. Slowly, he reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, his movements deliberate. Ethan's hand flew back to his holster. "Don't move," he barked, his voice cracking with strain. Devon paused, his gaze locking onto Ethan's. "Relax," he said coolly. "I'm just getting my badge." Confusion flickered across Ethan's face, his sneer faltering. "Your badge?" he scoffed, but his bravado wavered. Devon pulled out a sleek leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming police badge. The crowd's murmurs swelled into gasps of shock as he held it aloft. "My name is Devon Carter," he declared, his voice steady and commanding. "And I'm your new precinct captain." Ethan's jaw slackened, color draining from his face as he stumbled back, the ground shifting beneath him. What did you just say?" he stammered, his world collapsing. Devon's gaze hardened, his patience replaced by steel. "I said I'm Captain Carter, the new head of this department, and you, Officer Kane, just made the biggest mistake of your career." The crowd exploded cheers, jeers, and disbelief tangling together as phones zoomed in on Devon's badge. "He's the captain," someone shouted, their voice rising above the chaos. "This guy tried to arrest his boss." Ethan snapped out of his daze, desperation clawing at him. "That's impossible. This has to be a joke." "No joke," Devon replied, his tone clipped and final. He turned to Ryan, his eyes sharp. "Officer Collins, do me a favor and confirm this for your partner, would you?" Ryan stepped forward, his hands steady as he examined the badge. He nodded, his voice ringing out for all to hear. "It's real. He's telling the truth." Ethan's panic surged, his head shaking violently. "No way. This is a setup. You're not my captain." Devon arched an eyebrow, his calm unshaken. "You really want to double down on this, Kane? After planting drugs in my car and threatening to shoot me?" Ethan's voice cracked, his defenses crumbling. "That's not what happened. You don't understand. There have been reports of drug activity in this area. I was following protocol." Devon's eyes narrowed, his tone turning icy. "Protocol? You think violating my rights, planting evidence, and assaulting me is protocol? You saw a black man in a nice car and decided I was a criminal. No questions, no hesitation." Ethan's gaze darted to the crowd, their phones relentless, his panic a living thing. "I can explain," he began, but Devon cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade. "There's nothing to explain." He turned to Ryan, his authority absolute. "Officer Collins, you witnessed everything tonight. Can you confirm the events as I've described them?" Ryan nodded, his voice clear and unwavering. "Yes, sir. I saw Officer Kane plant the evidence. I saw him escalate this without cause." Ethan's fury erupted, a raw, animal roar as he lunged at Ryan. "You lying little snake." The crowd gasped, recoiling as Ryan stepped back, his hand instinctively brushing his belt. "Don't, Kane," he shouted, his voice firm despite the adrenaline spiking through him. Devon moved between them, his presence a wall of command. "Stand down, Kane," he ordered, his voice low but unyielding. Ethan froze, his fists trembling, his chest heaving. "You're going to regret this," he hissed, his eyes darting between them. "Both of you." Devon didn't blink. "The only one regretting anything tonight is you. Hand over your badge and weapon. You're suspended." The words landed like a gavel, final and resounding, a stark reminder of justice's reach. Ethan's hands shook as he unclipped his badge, his career slipping through his fingers like sand. The crowd pressed closer, their voices a cacophony of judgment. But beneath it all lay a deeper truth. Power, when abused, carried a cost. And tonight, that lesson had been etched in fire and steel. The night air crackled with tension, thick and suffocating, as Ethan Kane's world unraveled before a swelling crowd. His face twisted into a mask of raw, unbridled rage, his eyes burning with a fire that flickered between defiance and desperation. "You can't do this to me," he bellowed, his voice hoarse. cracking under the strain of his crumbling authority. Every muscle in his body tensed, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened, as if he could physically hold onto the power slipping through his fingers. Across from him stood Devin Carter, his expression an icy wall of resolve, unshaken by Ethan's outburst. "I just did," Devin replied, his words cutting through the chaos like a blade, calm and deliberate, carrying the weight of finality. Ethan's breath hitched, his chest heaving as he glared at Devin, the man who had once been a colleague, but now loomed as an unyielding judge. "Turn them in." "Now," Devin ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. For a fleeting moment, Ethan hesitated, his defiance wavering like a flickering flame in a storm. The gravity of the situation pressed down on him, a suffocating burden that made his shoulders sag. His badge, his shield, his identity felt heavier than ever as he reached for it. With a trembling hand, he unhooked it from his uniform, the metal glinting faintly under the streetlights. His gun followed, shoved into Devin's outstretched hands with a force born of resentment. The crowd, buzzing with restless energy, erupted into cheers, their voices rising in a chaotic symphony of triumph. "Justice for Captain Carter," one voice cried out, sharp and piercing, while another roared, "Fire him!" The words fueled the growing fervor, a wildfire of outrage spreading through the onlookers. Devin didn't flinch. He turned swiftly to Ryan Collins, a young officer whose wide eyes betrayed a mix of awe and uncertainty. "Officer Collins, contact dispatch," Devin instructed, his voice steady as steel. "Tell them we need more units to secure this scene and transport Officer Kane." Ryan nodded quickly, his fingers fumbling for his radio as adrenaline coursed through him. "Yes, sir," he managed, his voice tight but resolute, the weight of his role in this moment sinking in. He pressed the button, his words clipped and urgent as he relayed the command, the static crackling faintly in response. The crowd's chants grew louder, a pulsing heartbeat of fury and hope, their phones held high, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Ethan shot Devin one last venomous glare, his lips trembling as he forced out a whisper. "This isn't over." Devin met his gaze, his eyes hard and unyielding. "You're right, Kane. It's not over. But I swear to you justice will be served." The onlookers surged closer, their focus shifting from Ethan's disgrace to Devin's commanding presence. He straightened his shoulders, his uniform crisp despite the chaos, and faced the crowd with a quiet authority that silenced their murmurs. "What happened here tonight is beyond unacceptable," he began, his voice carrying over the restless hum. "I give you my word this department will not stand for misconduct or the abuse of power. This is just the start of the changes we'll build together." The anger in the air softened, replaced by tentative applause, a fragile thread of hope weaving through the mob. Ryan edged closer to Devin, his breath still uneven from the intensity of it all. "Thank you, sir," he murmured, his voice low and earnest, "for standing up." Devin glanced at him, his stern facade softening for a moment. "You stood up first, Collins. Don't forget that." The situation was far from settled, but a sliver of truth had pierced the darkness, and for the first time that night, the scales of justice felt within reach. The street descended into pandemonium, emboldened by Devin's revelation and Ethan's exposed corruption. The crowd's shouts swelled into a deafening roar. "Fire him now," a man bellowed, his voice thick with years of pent-up frustration. "Lock him up," another cried, her tone sharp with betrayal, quickly joined by a chorus of agreement. Dozens of phones remained aloft, their screens glowing like fireflies, preserving every heartbeat of the confrontation. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his face a storm of fury and humiliation, the sting of his unraveling power etched into every line of his expression. He could feel their eyes boring into him, accusing, unrelenting. "Step back." He barked at the encroaching crowd, but his command faltered, lacking its former bite. They didn't retreat. Instead, a few bold souls pressed closer, their fingers jabbing the air toward him. One man, his face flushed with rage, shouted, "You're the reason we can't trust cops like you." His words hit Ethan like a punch, igniting a flicker of panic deep in his chest. His hand twitched, torn between the instinct to lash out and the growing realization that he was cornered. His eyes darted wildly first to Devin, standing tall and unshakable, then to Ryan, who now carried a quiet resolve that Ethan hadn't noticed before. "This isn't over," he growled under his breath, the words more a plea to himself than a threat. Then, like a trapped animal sensing its cage closing in, he bolted. Spinning on his heel, Ethan shoved through the crowd, his shoulder slamming into a bystander as he snarled, "Get out of my way." The man stumbled, cursing, but Ethan didn't look back. The crowd exploded into shouts, their phones tracking his every frantic step. "He's running!" Someone yelled, their voice rising above the din. "Stop him!" Devon reacted without hesitation. "Ryan, with me," he barked, already breaking into a sprint. Ryan followed, his heart pounding in his ears as he watched Ethan fling open the patrol car door. Ethan lunged for the driver's seat, his hands shaking as they grappled with the keys still dangling in the ignition. His mind raced escape, destroy the evidence, salvage something from this wreckage. But before he could slide inside, Devon reached him, slamming the door shut with a force that reverberated through the night. "You're not going anywhere, Kane," Devon said, his voice a low, frigid command. Ethan's desperation boiled over. "Get your hands off me," he shouted, shoving Devon back with his shoulder. Devon staggered but regained his footing, his resolve unshaken. "You're making this worse for yourself. Stand down." Ethan wasn't listening. His eyes locked onto the passenger seat, where the stash of planted evidence lay hidden beneath the upholstery. If he could reach it, burn it, bury it, maybe he could still claw his way out. He lunged again, this time for the other door, but Ryan was there, blocking his path like a wall. "Enough, sir," Ryan said firmly, his hands raised in a defensive stance, though his voice trembled with the effort to stay calm. "Move," Ethan snapped, shoving Ryan aside with a wild swing. The younger officer stumbled, his boots scraping the pavement, but he steadied himself, his pulse racing as he saw Ethan's hand dart toward the seat. "No," Ryan shouted, lunging forward and grabbing Ethan's arm just as his fingers brushed the bag. They grappled, their movements a blur of aggression and resistance. Ethan twisted violently, trying to wrench free, but Ryan held tight, his grip fueled by a surge of determination. Devon joined the fray, seizing Ethan's other arm and yanking him back. "Let go," Ethan roared, his voice raw with desperation. "Drop it," Devon ordered, his hands like iron as he tightened his hold. The crowd roared with excitement, their cheers and jeers a chaotic backdrop to the struggle. Phones captured every second, the flashes of light illuminating the officers' strained faces. Ethan, realizing he was outnumbered, resorted to brute force. He drove his elbow into Devon's ribs, breaking free for a fleeting moment, then swung at Ryan. The younger officer ducked, his reflexes sharp and in a fluid motion. He hooked his leg around Ethan's, sending him crashing to the pavement with a heavy thud. The crowd erupted into wild applause. "That's right. Take him down," someone shouted, their voice ringing with vindication. Ethan thrashed on the ground, but Ryan was on him in an instant, pinning his arms behind his back. "Stop resisting," Ryan commanded, his tone sharp and unwavering. Devon knelt beside them, securing Ethan's wrists with cuffs, the metallic click cutting through the scuffle like a gavel strike. Ethan lay there, panting, his cheek pressed against the cold, gritty pavement. "You don't know what you've done," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "You're all making a mistake." Devon rose to his full height, towering over him. "No, Kane, the only mistake here was yours." The crowd's cheers swelled as sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the arrival of more officers. The additional units moved swiftly, pushing back the onlookers, though not before every last detail of Ethan's downfall was immortalized on video. Ryan stepped back, catching his breath, his hands still trembling as he watched Devon take charge. "Get him out of here," Devon ordered the arriving officers, his voice firm, "and make sure that evidence stays intact. We'll need it for the investigation." Two officers hauled Ethan to his feet, his face a twisted mess of rage and defeat as they dragged him toward a waiting patrol car. He spat over his shoulder, his voice dripping with defiance. "This isn't the end. You'll see." Devon ignored him, turning to Ryan instead. "You handled yourself well, Officer Collins," he said, his tone carrying a rare note of approval. Ryan nodded, though his hands still shook slightly. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice steadying as pride flickered in his chest. The crowd began to thin, some lingering with their phones still rolling. Their murmurs a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. One man approached Devon, his steps tentative, his eyes searching. "Captain Carter," he said, his voice wavering but earnest. "You're really going to make sure justice is served, right?" Devon met his gaze, his expression unwavering. "That's exactly what I intend to do. This department will answer for what happened here tonight." The man nodded, a faint relief softening his features as he melted back into the dispersing crowd. Ryan glanced at Devon, his brow furrowing slightly. "Do you think they'll believe us, that we're really going to change things?" Devon looked out at the remaining onlookers, their faces a mix of skepticism and longing. Then back at Ryan. "They don't have a reason to believe us yet," he admitted, his voice low but firm. "But we're going to give them one." The sirens faded, the chaos slowly ebbing. But the weight of the night hung heavy in the air. Phones buzzed as videos spread, the story rippling far beyond the street, beyond the precinct. Ethan stood cuffed, his fury now a hollow shell, his humiliation complete. The crowd's chants justice, "Arrest him, no more corrupt cops," echoed like a verdict. A reminder that power, when abused, carries a steep and unforgiving price. For Devon and Ryan, it was a lesson etched in the night's tumult. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a promise, one they'd fight to keep. The air crackled with fury as Ethan spun around, his face a deep crimson, veins pulsing at his temples. "You don't know a damn thing," he bellowed, his voice raw and jagged, slicing through the restless hum of the gathered crowd. 20 years I've poured into these streets, scraping filth off the pavement, keeping this city from choking on itself. This department doesn't need spineless fools like him, it needs men like me, men with guts." His words didn't just ripple through the onlookers, they ignited a wildfire. From the throng, a sharp cry pierced back, "Liar." The accusation landed like a stone through glass. And another voice joined, venomous and unafraid. "You're why we can't trust cops anymore." The crowd's anger swelled, a living thing, feeding off Ethan's defiance and growing hungrier by the second. Ethan didn't flinch, his broad shoulders squared as he whipped back toward Devon, his voice climbing over the rising clamor like a storm breaking loose. "This is your doing, Carter. You strut in here, badge gleaming like some knight in a fairy tale, thinking you can rewrite how things work. You're utterly clueless about the real game out here." His eyes blazed with a mix of contempt and desperation. A man clinging to the edge of a crumbling empire. Devon, unshaken, took a deliberate step closer, his boots scuffing the cracked pavement. His voice came low, icy, each word a hammer striking steel. "I know exactly how it works, Kane. And I know rot like yours doesn't belong here, not in this department, not in this city." The tension snapped like a taut wire. Ethan lunged, his movements wild and jagged, the handcuffs rattling around his wrists doing little to temper his fury. His breath came in harsh gasps, his intent clear, to close the gap, to make Devon feel the weight of his rage. But before he could reach him, 2 officers surged forward, their hands clamping onto his shoulders with practiced force. They yanked him back, his boots skidding against the ground, his momentum snuffed out. "This isn't over, Carter," Ethan spat, his voice hoarse, cracking under the strain of his own desperation. "You hear me? This isn't over." The crowd pressed in tighter, a sea of faces illuminated by the flickering glow of phone screens. Every angle of the chaos captured, every shout amplified. The noise was a deafening roar now, a cacophony of outrage and exhilaration. Devon's jaw tightened as he cut through the din with a single, sharp command, "Get him out of here." His tone carried the weight of finality, a blade slicing through the uproar. The officers obeyed, their grips firm as they steered Ethan toward the patrol car waiting at the curb, its lights pulsing red and blue against the dusk. Ethan twisted as they dragged him, his voice splintering as he shouted over his shoulder, "They'll see, Carter. You're nothing without that Bagina thing." The crowd erupted again, a chaotic symphony of cheers and jeers, their energy electric, sparking in the cooling evening air. The car door slammed shut, muffling Ethan's final curses, and as the vehicle peeled away, Its siren waylaid a shrill farewell that carved through the twilight. Ryan Collins lingered at the edge of the scene, his chest tight with a tangle of emotions he couldn't quite unravel. His eyes flicked to Devon, who stood like a lighthouse amid the storm, calm and unyielding despite the tempest swirling around him. Ryan edged closer, his voice dropping to a hushed murmur beneath the fading noise. "Captain, do you think this'll hold? Will it stick?" Devon's gaze shifted to him, steady and measured, before he gave a slight nod. "It's enough for now, Collins. But this is just the first step. We've got a mountain of work ahead." Ryan swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling into his bones. As the officers wrestled Ethan into the car, his face pressed against the glass, a grotesque mask of defiance and despair. "You're all fools," he roared, his voice muffled but venomous. "You think this department can stand without men like me? You need US, I need me." The door's slam cut him off, a guillotine dropping on his tirade. The crowd burst into applause, a thunderous wave of sound that rolled over the street as the patrol car vanished into the distance. Devon turned to face them, raising a hand with quiet authority. The noise ebbed, a tide receding under his steady presence. "Thank you for your patience tonight," he began, his voice firm yet warm, a beacon in the fading light. "What you saw here is a move toward accountability. I give you my word, no one stands above the law, not even those who wear the badge." A murmur rippled through the onlookers, their phones still aloft, lenses trained on him like unblinking eyes. Devon's gaze softened as it swept over them. "This department has a long road ahead. Tonight's just the beginning, but we can't walk it alone. We need your voices, your trust, your partnership to rebuild what's been broken." From the crowd, a young woman stepped forward, her phone still recording, her dark eyes sharp with skepticism. "Are you really gonna clean this place up?" she asked, her tone edged with doubt, a challenge wrapped in hope. Devon met her stare, unflinching. "Yes, and I'll start by ensuring nights like this never happen again." She held his gaze for a long moment before lowering her phone, a flicker of belief softening her features. A cautious optimism spread through the crowd, fragile but growing. Ryan watched the exchange, a spark of something unfamiliar igniting in his chest up. Tentative and raw, for the first time, he felt the ground beneath them shifting, tilting toward something better. Devon's hand landed on his shoulder, firm and grounding. "Let's head back, Collins. This isn't over yet." Ryan nodded, casting a final glance at the dispersing crowd. Their faces were a mosaic of emotion, anger still simmering, relief breaking through, curiosity flickering like a flame. Those same feelings churned within him, mirrored in the echoes of the crowd's chants as he and Devon climbed into their car. They drove in silence, the weight of the night pressing down, the road ahead stretching into an uncertain dawn. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with a different kind of tension. Captain Devon Carter stood at the head of a cramped conference room, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken dread. Internal affairs officers lined the table, their faces grim as Devon's voice cut through the haze. "This is where we dig in," he said, his tone resolute, a steel thread running through every syllable. "Ethan Kane's actions weren't a fluke. We're peeling back every layer any officer tied to his mess answers for it." Lieutenant Daniels, head of internal affairs, gave a curt nod, his jaw tight. "We've already started. Traffic stops, arrests, complaints, anything with Kane's fingerprints or his crew's. It's a long haul." "Captain." Devon's eyes shifted to Ryan, who sat at the table's edge, shoulders rigid despite the unease gnawing at his gut. "Collins, I need your full statement today. You were there, you saw it all." Ryan's throat tightened, but he forced his voice steady. "Yes, sir." Beneath the table, his hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms as memories of the night replayed. Ethan's snarls, the crowd's roar, the cold glint of Devon's resolve. The investigation unfurled like a storm gathering speed. Hours bled into days as the team sifted through a mire of evidence, falsified arrests, evidence planted like seeds in tainted soil, racial profiling etched into reports with chilling precision. The list grew longer, darker, a ledger of corruption that stretched beyond Ethan alone. Devon and Ryan hunched over files late into the night, the precinct's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Witness testimonies poured in, halting voices recounting threats, coerced confessions, lives upended by men sworn to protect. On the third day, Devon slammed a thick folder shut, his frustration boiling over. "This isn't just one rotten bastard," he growled, his usual calm fraying at the edges. "It's a damn infestation." Ryan looked up from his notes, exhaustion shadowing his eyes. "What happens when we take this higher? Some of these Geist have got decades on the force, connections deep as roots." Devon's gaze turned flinty. "We take it higher anyway. Hesitate, and we're no better than they are." Word of the probe spread through the precinct like wildfire. Some officers whispered approval in quiet corners, their nods subtle but real. Others bristled, their loyalty to the old guard unshaken. One afternoon, Ryan stepped into the break room, the chatter dying the moment his boots crossed the threshold. A cluster of senior officers stood by the coffee machine, their eyes narrowing as he passed. "Collins," one called out, his voice a blade wrapped in silk. Ryan turned, meeting the icy stare of Officer Mitchell, Ethan's shadow and fiercest ally. "You think you're a hero, huh? Turning on your own like that? You don't belong here, kid." Ryan's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. "I didn't turn on anyone. I stood for what's right." Mitchell stepped closer, his breath sour with coffee and spite. "You don't get how it works. Keep this up. You'll wish you'd stayed quiet." Before Ryan could fire back, Devon strode in, his presence a sudden hush over the room. His eyes swept the group, lingering on Mitchell with a weight that could crush stone. "Problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with steel. Mitchell held his stare for a heartbeat before stepping back, muttering, "No problem, Captain." "Good," Devon said, his tone final. "This department's got enough trouble without you lot clawing at each other." Ryan exhaled, a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd held. As Devon gave him a subtle nod before returning to his desk, the fallout was swift. Ryan felt the shift conversations halted when he entered. Glances slid sideways down dim hallways. One late shift, he found a note crammed into his locker. The scrawl jagged and furious, "Snitchies don't last long." He stared at it, the words burning into his mind. Before crushing it in his fist and tossing it away, his jaw clenched as he slammed the locker shut, resolve hardening in his chest. The next morning, he marched into Devon's office, chin high. "Captain, I'm in all the way. Whatever it takes." Devon leaned back, a rare flicker of pride softening his stern features. "Good, because we're just getting started." Internal affairs moved like a blade through the precinct's underbelly, amassing evidence that pinned 3 more officers to Ethan's web. 2 were suspended, their badges stripped pending hearings. The 3rd was shoved onto administrative leave, his fate dangling by a thread. The news hit like a shockwave, splintering the precinct's fragile unity. Tensions flared. Some officers accused Devon of betrayal, their voices rising in a heated meeting. "You're ripping us apart," one shouted, his face red with indignation. Devon didn't waver. "No, I'm fixing what's been festering too long. You're either with the cure or the disease." Ryan watched from the sidelines, his admiration for Devon deepening with every clash. The captain's resolve was a lesson in justice, and not just a word, but a force, relentless and unyielding. Outside, the city stirred. Media seized the story. Headlines screaming, "Corruption scandal rocks police force officers face fire for bias." Protesters gathered beyond the precinct's doors, their signs stark against the gray morning. "End police corruption. Justice now." Their chants echoed through the walls, a drumbeat of consequence for those who'd abused their power. A reminder that the scales of justice, once tipped, demanded balance. For Ethan, for his allies, for the department itself, the reckoning had only begun. One crisp evening, under a sky streaked with the fading hues of dusk, Devon stood before a restless crowd, his voice rising like a beacon through the murmurs and shouts. It carried a weight of unshakable conviction, cutting through the tension that hung thick in the air. "We hear you," he declared, his tone steady yet infused with a quiet fire. "This investigation isn't some smoke and mirrors game. To bury the truth, it's about dragging it into the light. It's about accountability, about making sure those who wield power answer for it. I give you my word, we will see this through." The crowd shifted, some nodding with cautious hope, others still simmering with doubt. but Devon's resolve stood firm, a lighthouse amid their storm. Meanwhile, Ryan felt a surge of confidence swelling within him, a tide that had been building despite the relentless backlash crashing against him. Night after night, he hunched over his desk in the dimly lit precinct, the flicker of his lamp casting long shadows across stacks of reports. His fingers, stained with ink, danced over pages as he pieced together testimonies, scrutinized every detail, and triple-checked every fact. The weight of the task pressed on his shoulders, but it only fueled his determination. One late evening, as the clock ticked past midnight and the precinct grew eerily silent, Devon stepped into the room. His silhouette filled the doorway, a quiet strength in his presence. "You've been at this non-stop, Collins," he said, his voice low but warm, tinged with concern. Ryan didn't look up from his work, his brow furrowed in focus. "I can't stop now," he replied, his words clipped but resolute. "Not until it's finished." Devon lingered for a moment, studying the younger officer's relentless drive, then allowed a faint smile to soften his features. "You're doing good work, Ryan. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The words landed like a steady hand on Ryan's shoulder, lifting some of the invisible burden he carried. By the end of that grueling week, the precinct felt like a different world. Effen's arrest had sent shockwaves through the department, rattling its very foundation. The air was thick with uneasy officers whispered in corners, their eyes darting nervously. While the leadership grappled with the fallout, the investigation had peeled back layers of rot, exposing cracks that ran deep. The pressure was suffocating, a vice tightening around every soul in the building, and the road ahead loomed uncertain, shrouded in fog. Yet, beneath the chaos, a fragile glimmer of possibility emerged. For the first time in years, there was a whisper of hope, a chance that the department might shed its tarnished skin and become something better, something worthy of trust. Justice, it seemed, might not be a distant dream after all. Inside the courtroom, tension buzzed like static electricity, crackling through the packed gallery. Ethan Kane sat at the defendant's table, his jaw locked tight, a muscle twitching beneath his stubbled skin as his attorney leaned in, whispering strategies in hushed, urgent tones. His eyes, dark and stormy, betrayed a roiling mix of defiance and dread. Across the room, Captain Devon Carter and Officer Ryan Collins waited in stoic silence, their faces carved from determination. Devon's posture was unyielding, his broad shoulders squared as if bearing the weight of the entire department, while Ryan's hands fidgeted slightly, betraying the nerves simmering beneath his calm exterior. The gallery overflowed with onlookers, reporters scribbling furiously, community leaders exchanging grave nods, and off-duty officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, all drawn to witness the reckoning of a man who had once been one of their own. The judge's gavel slammed down, a thunderclap that silenced the room. "This court is now in session," she announced, her voice sharp and commanding. "We'll begin with opening statements." Effen's attorney rose with a practiced air of confidence, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone smooth and deliberate, "my client, Officer Ethan Kane, has served this city for over 2 decades with unwavering dedication. He's faced the ugliest corners of our streets, putting his life on the line to keep us safe. Yes, his methods may have been unorthodox, but they were born from a deep sense of duty. We will demonstrate that his actions, though misunderstood, were always in service of this community." The words hung in the air, slick and carefully crafted, but Ryan couldn't suppress the tightening of his jaw. He shot a glance at Devon, who met his eyes with a flicker of shared frustration. The defense's spin was a bitter pill, twisting Effen's betrayal into a noble sacrifice. The prosecution wasted no time tearing into that narrative. Their lead attorney, a woman with a gaze like steel, stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "This case isn't about protecting the public," she declared, her words dripping with controlled fury. "It's about the abuse of power." Officer Kane didn't bend the rules, shattered them. He planted evidence, trampled on rights, and spat on the trust this community placed in him. "We will prove, beyond any doubt, that his actions weren't driven by justice, but by prejudice and corruption." The accusation landed like a grenade, its impact rippling through the courtroom. Ethan's face darkened, his fingers curling into fists beneath the table as he fought to maintain his composure. On the second day, Ethan took the stand, his broad frame filling the witness box. His demeanor was a volatile blend of bravado and self-pity. His shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible yoke. His attorney guided him through a rehearsed tale, each word dripping with calculated emotion. "I've seen the worst this city has to offer," Ethan said, his voice rough and heavy, practiced tears glinting in his eyes. "I've faced down criminals who'd do anything to slip through the cracks. Sometimes you have to bend the rules to protect the people who can't protect themselves." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, his gaze sweeping the jury as if pleading for their understanding. The prosecutor rose, her expression honed to a razor's edge. "Officer Kane," she began, her tone icy, "are you suggesting that planting evidence is an acceptable practice for law enforcement?" Ethan faltered, his bravado flickering. "I'm saying it's complicated," he muttered, his voice losing its edge. "The streets aren't black and white like you think. You don't know what it's like out there." She didn't flinch. "Perhaps not," she shot back, "but I do know that falsifying evidence ruins lives. How do you justify framing Captain Carter, a man you now know was your superior?" Ethan's face flushed a deep crimson, his breath quickening. "I didn't know who he was," he snapped. "He was driving a nice car, acting suspicious." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, her voice biting. "Or was it because of the color of his skin?" Ethan's mouth opened, but the words died in his throat, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. When Ryan's turn came, he strode to the stand with purpose, his uniform crisp, the badge on his chest gleaming under the courtroom lights. His heart pounded, but his resolve was ironclad. "Officer Collins," the prosecutor began, her tone softening slightly, "you were present the night of the incident. Can you tell us what you saw?" Ryan nodded, his voice steady as he recounted the memory that had haunted him for weeks. "I saw Officer Kane plant a bag of narcotics under Captain Carter's seat. It wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. He escalated the situation, using force and intimidation without any reason." Across the room, Ethan's glare bore into him, his fists clenching so tightly his knuckles whitened. "Why did you speak up?" the prosecutor pressed. Ryan met her gaze, unflinching. "Because it was the right thing to do. We're supposed to serve and protect, not abuse the power we're given." His words rang out, simple yet profound, a testament to the line he refused to cross. Devon's testimony followed, and he took the stand with a calm that belied the storm within. His deep voice filled the room as he recounted the traffic stop with surgical precision, every detail etched into his memory. His steady demeanor stood in stark contrast to Ethan's earlier volatility, a quiet strength that commanded respect. "Captain Carter," the prosecutor said, "what message do you think Officer Kane's actions send to the community?" Devon's eyes swept the room, lingering on the faces in the gallery, some hopeful, some hardened by years of distrust. "That they can't trust us," he replied, his voice firm but tinged with sorrow. "And that's unacceptable. This department has to be better, and it starts by holding people like Kane accountable." His words were a vow, a promise to rebuild what had been broken. As the prosecution rested, Ethan's composure shattered. The weight of the testimony, the damning evidence, and the piercing stares of the community bore down on him like a collapsing wall. His rage erupted, raw and uncontainable. "You're lying," he roared, slamming his hands on the table with a force that rattled the room. The gallery froze, breaths held, as the judge's gavel cracked through the silence. "Order in the court," she demanded, her voice a whip. Ethan ignored her, surging to his feet, his finger jabbing toward Ryan. "You little traitor, after everything I taught you, this is how you repay me." Ryan didn't flinch, his expression carved from stone. "I stood up for the truth, Ethan," he said quietly. "Something you forgot a long time ago." Ethan's face twisted with fury, and before anyone could react, he lunged toward the stand, his hands outstretched as if to throttle the younger officer. The gallery erupted into chows, gasps, and shouts filling the air as court security swarmed, tackling Ethan to the floor. "Get off me," he bellowed, thrashing against their grip. "This isn't over." Devon rose, his voice cutting through the pandemonium like a blade. "Enough. Kane, you've already done enough damage." The judge's gavel pounded relentlessly. "This behavior is unacceptable. Officer Kane, you're in contempt of court." As the guards dragged him out, his shouts echoed down the hall. "You'll regret this, Carter. You'll all regret this," a fading threat swallowed by the closing doors. The trial pressed on, the chaos subsiding into an uneasy calm. Hours later, the jury returned, their faces grim but resolute. "Guilty on all charges," the foreman announced, and a collective sigh rippled through the gallery. A release of tension, a flicker of vindication. The judge delivered the sentence: 8 years in prison, her voice solemn as she addressed the room. "This isn't just about one man," she said, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "It's about a message: no one stands above the law, especially those sworn to uphold it. When power is abused, justice demands consequences." The words lingered, heavy with the weight of their truth. Outside the courthouse, Devon faced a sea of reporters and protesters, their voices a cacophony of questions and demands. He raised a hand, silencing them, his presence commanding attention. "Today's verdict is a step toward accountability," he said, his voice steady but laced with determination. "But our work isn't finished. We must keep pushing to rebuild trust, to make this department a true servant of the people." Ryan stood beside him, the trial's burden finally lifting from his shoulders. As the crowd began to thin, he turned to Devon, his voice soft with uncertainty. "Do you think this will really change things?" Devon's gaze drifted to the horizon, thoughtful. "It's a start, Collins. Real change doesn't come in a flash, it's forged every day, in the choices we make." Captain Devon Carter didn't waste a moment after the verdict. The department's reputation lay in tatters, a fragile thread dangling over an abyss of public distrust. Change wasn't optional, it was a lifeline. In the precinct's briefing room, he stood before a sea of officers, the air thick with tension. Some sat with arms crossed, their skepticism etched into every line of their faces. Others leaned forward, clinging to a shred of hope. "Effective immediately," Devon began, his voice a clarion call. "This department will undergo sweeping reforms to rebuild trust and restore integrity. It starts with us." He outlined the measures with unwavering clarity: body cameras for every officer on patrol, their footage audited regularly. "These aren't about catching mistakes," he explained, meeting the eyes of a few grumbling veterans. "They're about transparency for us and for the people we serve." Mandatory anti-bias training followed, no exceptions. "We all carry biases," he said, locking gazes with a skeptical sergeant in the back. "This isn't about blame, it's about awareness, about making better calls." Finally, a civilian oversight committee, a diverse group of community voices to review complaints and hold the department accountable. "We can't demand trust if we're the only ones policing ourselves," he stated. "The community deserves to be heard." The room buzzed with reaction. Some officers nodded, their faces softening with reluctant agreement, while others muttered under their breath, their resistance palpable. A grizzled senior officer, his badge dulled by decades of service, stood during a heated exchange. "This is going too far, Captain," he growled, his voice rough with frustration. "We're cops, not puppets for politicians. Letting civilians meddle will tie our hands." Devon didn't waver, his gaze piercing. "Your job is to serve and protect. If you can't do that with integrity, you're in the wrong line of work." The officer scoffed, storming out, his boots thudding against the floor. But Devon's words lingered, a challenge, a line in the sand. Justice, he knew, wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about building a system that didn't breed them. The lesson was clear: power without accountability was a poison, and its consequences rippled far beyond one man's fall. The air in the cramped meeting room hung heavy, thick with unspoken tension, as Devon leaned forward, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade tempered by resolve. "If you don't want every misstep blown into a full-blown scandal by those cameras and committees," he said, his tone icy and deliberate, "then don't screw up in ways that shatter the law or betray the trust of the very people you swore to shield." His words landed like stones, each one sinking into the minds of those around him, leaving a stillness that pressed against the walls. Devon wasn't just speaking, was laying bare a truth that had festered too long, a truth he carried like a weight on his shoulders. He knew deep down that tweaking the department's rules wouldn't cut it anymore. Real change demanded more than paperwork, and promises it demanded action, raw and unfiltered. That realization drove him and Ryan Collins beyond the precinct's sterile halls and into the beating heart of the community. They started showing up at local gatherings, not as enforcers but as listeners, their badges dulled by the humility of facing those they'd let down. One humid evening, inside a cavernous gymnasium, the atmosphere crackled with unease. Rows of folding chairs creaked under the weight of dozens of residents, their faces etched with suspicion, eyes narrowed as if daring the two officers to prove their worth. Devin stepped up to the microphone, the metal cool against his palm, his heart thudding with the gravity of the moment. "I'm not here to spin excuses or dodge the blame," he began, his voice steady as steel despite the quiver of doubt gnawing at his gut. "I'm here to hear you out, to face what we've done wrong. We failed you, and I own that. But hear me when I say this, we're going to make it right. I swear it." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of skepticism and fragile hope, like the first stirrings of wind before a storm. From the back of the room, a man shot to his feet, his sharp voice cutting through the buzz. "Why the hell should we trust you now? Cops like that bastard Kane have been tearing through this town like wolves for years, and nobody lifted a finger." His anger was a live wire, sparking with years of pent-up betrayal. Before Devin could respond, Ryan stepped forward, his broad frame casting a shadow across the scuffed wooden floor. "You're damn right," Ryan said, his voice firm but laced with a quiet ache, an empathy born from seeing too much go wrong. "We let it fester far too long. I've seen the damage up close, and it eats at me. But if we don't turn this ship around now, it'll never happen. And I'll be damned if I stand by and let that rot keep spreading." The man faltered, his fury softening at the edges, replaced by a flicker of reluctant consideration. "We'll see," he grumbled, sinking back into his chair, his arms crossed tight as if guarding against hope. After the meeting, as the crowd thinned and the echoes of voices faded, a young woman approached, her steps hesitant but her gaze piercing. She clutched a crumpled piece of paper, her fingers trembling slightly as she extended it toward Devin. "If you're serious about fixing this," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding, "here's where you start. These are the things we've been begging someone to care about for years." Devin took the list, his fingers brushing hers briefly, and as he scanned the scrawled words, neglected streets, unchecked abuses, broken promises, his jaw tightened with a fierce determination. "Thank you," he said, meeting her eyes with a resolve that felt like a vow carved in stone. "We'll get to work on this. All of it." Beyond those tense gymnasium nights, Devin and Ryan took their mission to the streets, shedding the stiff formality of their uniforms for something more human. They showed up at block parties, the smoky scent of barbecues mingling with laughter, where they traded stiff nods for genuine smiles. They laced up sneakers and joined pickup basketball games, with kids whose wary glances slowly melted into grins. At one park cleanup, Ryan found himself roped into a chaotic game with a pack of teenagers, their shouts and trash talk bouncing off the cracked asphalt court. Devin lingered on the sidelines, leaning against a weathered picnic table, chatting with parents who watched with guarded optimism. One father, a weary man with a faded baseball cap, nodded toward Ryan as he sank a jump shot. "Officer Collins ain't half bad out there," he said, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Devin's eyes followed Ryan, a swell of pride warming his chest. "He's all in," Devin replied, his voice low but firm. "That's what this department's been missing, people who give a damn." As the game wound down, a small boy darted over, his sneakers scuffing the dirt, a basketball tucked under his arm. His wide eyes sparkled with curiosity as he peered up at Devin. "Are you really the big boss of all the cops?" he asked, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. Devin crouched down, the ache in his knees forgotten as he met the boy's gaze. "I'm trying to be," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Though his heart clenched with the weight of that truth, the boy beamed, bouncing the ball once. "Then make sure they're nice, okay?" Devin's smile faltered, a shadow of seriousness crossing his face. "I promise you, kid," he said, his tone soft but resolute. "We're working on it every single day." But progress wasn't a straight line, and not everyone welcomed the shift. beneath the surface. A knot of officers bristled at the changes, their whispers coiling into a quiet rebellion. They formed a loose coalition, grumbling that Devon's reforms stripped them of their power, turning them into punching bags for a community they'd long ruled with impunity. Discontent simmered, seeping into the precinct like damp rot. Ryan felt it most at his locker. Once a mundane corner of his routine, became a canvas for their spite. One morning, he found traitor scrawled across it in jagged red spray paint, the letters dripping like blood. The sight hit him like a punch, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he marched straight to Devon, his jaw set. "This crap isn't going to scare me off," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. Devon met his gaze, a flicker of admiration in his tired eyes. "Good," he said, clapping a hand on Ryan's shoulder, "because we need fighters like you now more than ever." Months rolled by, and the first glimmers of change began to pierce the gloom. Complaints of misconduct plummeted, a statistic that felt like a lifeline to Devon as he pored over reports late into the night. The community's trust, once a tattered thread, started to mend, reflected in approval ratings that crept upward like a slow sunrise. Standing beside Ryan one crisp afternoon, Devon felt a fragile spark of hope flicker in his chest. The path ahead stretched long and treacherous, but for the first time, it seemed they were clawing their way toward something better. Justice, he thought, wasn't just a word, it was a reckoning, a promise that power unchecked would always reap consequences. Yet not everyone shared their victories. A shadowy faction within the department, tethered to the legacy of Ethan Kane, a man whose name still carried the stench of corruptioners, their grudges in secret. Among them was Jacob, a former officer whose disgrace hadn't dulled his venom. With his ties to the city's underbelly, he wove a network of discontent, plotting a strike to remind Devon and Ryan who really held the reins. Their plan crystallized into something brutal, a message delivered not in words, but in violence. It was late one evening when the trap sprang. Devon and Ryan were cruising a quiet stretch of town, the patrol car humming softly through streets, bathed in the dim glow of flickering streetlights. Ryan gripped the wheel, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, while Devon hunched over his tablet, squinting at reports under the faint dashboard light. The stillness felt unnatural, the damp pavement shimmering like a warning. Then, out of the shadows, a black SUV roared into view, its engine growling as it closed the distance fast. Ryan's gut tightened. "That car's been tailing us for blocks," he said, his voice taut with unease. Devon's head snapped up, his instincts kicking in. "Stay sharp," he ordered, his hand inching toward the radio. "Slow down, see if they pass." Ryan eased off the gas, the patrol car's pace dropping, but the SUV didn't overtake. Instead, it lurched closer, its dark bulk looming in the mirror. Without warning, it swerved violently, slamming into the rear of their car with a bone-rattling crunch. The impact jolted them forward, tires shrieking as Ryan wrestled the wheel. "They're ramming us," he shouted, adrenaline surging through his veins. Devon snatched the radio, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47, we're under attack. Black SUV, no plates, actively ramming us. Send backup now." The reply crackled faintly, but before it could fully come through, the SUV struck again, harder, shoving them toward the curb. "They're boxing us in," Ryan yelled, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "Don't let them," Devon barked, his mind racing. "Take the next right hard." Ryan yanked the wheel, the patrol car skidding around the corner in a scream of rubber and metal. The SUV dogged their tail, relentless, and from a side street, a second Vehicle sleek, dark sedan burst into the fray, cutting off their path. The patrol car screeched to a halt, trapped in a vice between the two. Figures spilled from the vehicles, cloaked in shadow, wielding bats and crowbars that glinted under the streetlights. Out of the car, one shouted, his voice a guttural snarl. Devon's hand flew to his holster, his pulse hammering. "Stay inside for now, Lockett," he said, his calm belying the storm within. Ryan hit the locks, the clicks swallowed by the pounding of weapons against the windows. Glass spiderwebbed under the blows, each crack a countdown. "They're breaking through," Ryan said, panic clawing at his throat. Devon's eyes narrowed, his voice steady as granite. "We're not sitting ducks." On my signal, reverse hard, then cut left. Ryan nodded, his sweaty palm gripping the gear shift. Now, Devon roared. Ryan slammed the car into reverse, the patrol car surging backward into the SUV with a sickening crunch. The attackers stumbled, thrown off balance, and Ryan shifted to drive, wrenching the wheel left and flooring it past the sedan. Tires wailed as they peeled away, but the SUV recovered fast, roaring after them like a predator scenting blood. The streets morphed into a war zone, the SUV weaving dangerously close, intent on forcing them off the road. "They're not giving up," Ryan shouted, swerving through intersections, his heart pounding in his ears. Devon grabbed the radio again. "Dispatch, this is Captain Carterware in a high-speed chase, hostile vehicles in pursuit. We need help now." The response crackled through. "Units en route, Captain." But Devon knew they were alone for now, a speck of defiance against the onslaught. "Stay sharp, Kalinsky'll try to corner us again." The SUV pulled alongside, a figure leaning out with a crowbar, swinging it with vicious force. The side mirror exploded in a shower of glass. "Hang on," Ryan yelled, veering away. Devon cracked his window, aimed his sidearm, and fired twice. The SUV's front tire erupted, sparks flying as it fishtailed and crashed into a parked car. "Good shot," Ryan gasped, but the relief evaporated as the sedan reappeared, barreling toward them from a side street. "Oncoming," Devon warned. Ryan slammed the brakes, the car shuddering as the sedan screeched to a stop ahead. Blocking their escape, armed men leapt out, this time with guns drawn, their intent clear. "Cover," Devon snapped, drawing his weapon as bullets ripped through the windshield. They ducked behind the patrol car's battered frame, glass crunching under their boots. "We're pinned," Ryan said, returning fire over the hood. His hands steadied despite the tremor in his chest. Devon scanned the chaos, his mind razor-sharp. "We end this now. You take left, I'll go right." Ryan nodded, his training locking into place. He leaned out, firing precise shots that forced the attackers to scramble for cover. Devon darted right, moving low, his breath shallow but controlled. 3 quick shots rang out from his gun, one catching an assailant in the leg. The man howled, crumpling to the pavement, clutching his wound. Ryan seized the opening, advancing with a barrage of gunfire that sent the others reeling, their weapons clattering to the ground. "Hands up," he bellowed, his voice a thunderclap. "Get down-o." Devon closed in, kicking the guns away with a cold precision. "You're finished," he said, his tone a blade of ice. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as backup swarmed the scene. Patrol cars flooded the street, officers spilling out to cuff the attackers, their shouts cutting through the night. Devon and Ryan stepped back, lowering their weapons, their breaths ragged but unbroken. "You okay?" Devon asked, his voice softening as he glanced at Ryan. Ryan nodded, his hands trembling faintly as the adrenaline ebbed. "I'm good," he said, though the weight of the night clung to him like damp earth. Devon rested a hand on his shoulder, a silent anchor amid the storm. They'd survived the message, but it was a stark reminder. Justice came at a cost, and power, when abused, always bred retribution. The fight wasn't over, but they'd proven they wouldn't break. Not yet. The air hung thick with tension that morning, a palpable weight pressing down on the bustling streets of Riverest. The city buzzed with its usual rhythm, cars honking, footsteps echoing, the faint aroma of coffee wafting from hurried hands, but beneath it all, an unspoken unease simmered. Captain Devon Carter stood amidst the chaos of the aftermath, his broad shoulders squared against the biting chill of the dawn. Blood still pounded in his ears, his heart a steady drumbeat as he watched the attackers being led away in cuffs, their wrists bound by the cold steel of justice. One of them, a weary man with a jagged scar slicing across his cheek, twisted his head back, his eyes locking onto Devon's with a venomous glare. "This isn't over, Carter," he spat, his voice a low growl, dripping with defiance. "You're making enemies more than you can handle." Devon didn't flinch, didn't blink. His jaw tightened, but his gaze remained unyielding, a wall of resolve. "Good," he said, his voice steady as granite. "That means I'm doing something right." Nearby, Officer Ryan Collins leaned against the dented frame of their patrol car, his chest heaving as he sucked in ragged breaths. The adrenaline still coursed through him, electric and wild, making his hands tremble faintly as he wiped sweat from his brow. The wreckage around them told the story of the ambush-shattered glass, glinting like jagged teeth on the asphalt, bullet casings scattered like fallen leaves, the air sharp with the acrid scent of gunpowder. What the hell was that? Ryan finally managed, his voice hoarse, his blue eyes wide with a mix of exhaustion and disbelief as he turned to Devon. The captain's expression darkened, his lips pressing into a grim line. "Push back," he replied, the word heavy with meaning. From people who'd rather see this city burn than change, Ryan's gaze swept over the scene, taking in the destruction, the sheer violence of it all. "They were ready to kill us to stop it," he murmured, more to himself than to Devon. The older man nodded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. "And that's exactly why we can't let up. Not now, not ever." The attack sent shockwaves rippling through Riverest, a city already frayed at the edges by years of mistrust and division. By noon, news vans had descended like vultures, their cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions into the wind. The story dominated every channel, every headline screaming of the brazen ambush on Captain Devon Carter and Officer Ryan Collins. Public outrage flared like wildfire. Citizens took to the streets, their voices rising in a chorus of anger and fear, while community leaders pounded podiums, demanding swift, unyielding justice. Inside the precinct, the pressure mounted, a suffocating weight on the shoulders of every officer. Whispers of corruption snaked through the ranks, rumors of betrayal festering like an open wound. For Devon, the attack wasn't just a physical assault, it was a searing, personal reminder that the path to reform was paved with resistance, that every step forward would draw blood. Yet, as he stood amidst the debris, his uniform streaked with dirt and resolve, he felt a fire reignite within him. They'd tried to break him, and they'd failed. That alone steeled his determination. The next morning, Devon strode into the precinct's briefing room, his boots echoing against the tiled floor with purpose. His dark eyes burned with intensity as he called an emergency meeting with internal affairs and the city commissioner. The room hummed with tension, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and nervous sweat. Lieutenant Daniels, a weary man with a hawkish nose and a perpetually furrowed brow, sat stiffly at the table, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm. The commissioner, a broad-shouldered woman with gray streaks in her hair and a no-nonsense stare, watched Devon closely. "This wasn't random," Devon began, his voice low but fierce, cutting through the silence like a blade. "This was a calculated strike coordinated by people inside this department and out there in the shadows, all working to tear down everything we fought for. We need to find them, drag them into the light, and make them answer for it." Daniels nodded, his sharp eyes glinting with a mix of dread and determination. "We're already digging," he said, his tone clipped, cross-referencing the attackers with Ethan Kane's known allies. The connections we're finding, they're ugly. Devon's lips twitched into a faint, approving grimace. "Good. Move faster. Every hour we waste, they're plotting their next move." Ryan lingered near the back of the room, his lean frame slouched slightly in his chair, his mind racing. The weight of the previous day clung to him like damp clothes, every sound, every flash of movement from the ambush replaying in his head. He'd joined the force young, idealistic, believing he could make a difference. Now, at 28, with the scars of yesterday still fresh, he felt the stakes sharpening around him. "We've got to deal with the ones still inside," he interjected, his voice quieter but no less firm. "The officers resisting the reformist ones sending threats, stirring up fear. They're just as dangerous." Devon turned to him, their eyes meeting in a moment of unspoken understanding. "You're right," Devon said, his tone resolute. "No more excuses, no more leniency. Accountability starts here, with us. Everyone in this department needs to know that." The ambush hadn't just shaken the city, it had lit a fuse. Soon after, Devon and Ryan stepped back into the community, their presence a deliberate defiance of the fear that lingered in the air. At a town hall meeting, the atmosphere crackled with raw emotion. The room was pacadros of folding chairs filled with restless citizens, their faces etched with worry, anger, hope. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting stark shadows on the worn linoleum floor. A man in a faded jacket stood up, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of his seat. "You promised us change, Captain Carter," he said, his voice rough with frustration. "But it feels like things are spiraling out of control. People are scared to walk the streets." Devon stepped forward, his tall frame imposing yet calm, his gaze locking onto the man's with quiet intensity. "You're not wrong," he admitted, his deep voice steady. "Change isn't clean or easy, it's a fight. And it's messy, but I swear to you, we're not backing down. That attack on me and Officer Collins, it proves we're hitting them where it hurts. That's how I know we're on the right track." From the back, another voice cut through the murmur, a woman, her tone sharp with skepticism. "How can we trust you when some of your own people are still the problem?" Ryan straightened, stepping up beside Devon, his youthful face set with determination. "Because we're not pretending it's perfect," he said, his voice ringing clear. "We're facing it head on. This department's changing, but it's not just on you, it's on all of you. Too. We need you with us." The crowd shifted, their hardened edges softening as his words sank in. Faces that had been pinched with doubt began to relax, a cautious flicker of hope replacing the cynicism. Outside, the evening sky deepened to a bruised purple, the city lights twinkling like stars against the growing dark. Back at the precinct, the gears of reform churned faster. Officers tied to Ethan Kane's shadowy net, workmen and women who'd once walked these halls, with smug impunity, found themselves suspended, their badges stripped as investigations deepened. New recruits faced a gauntlet of scrutiny, their backgrounds dissected with surgical precision. Devon unveiled a mentorship program, pairing seasoned officers who embraced the reforms with the wide-eyed rookies flooding in. Ryan threw himself into it, volunteering without hesitation. One humid afternoon, he stood in the training room, the faint hum of the air conditioner battling the stickiness in the air. A dozen recruits sat before him, their uniforms crisp, their faces a mix of nerves and eagerness. "I've been where you are," Ryan started, his voice warm but firm, his hands clasped behind his back. "I've seen what happens when we forget why we're here, when power twists into something ugly. But I've also seen what we can do when we hold ourselves accountable, when we choose to serve instead of rule. That's the road we're on now, and I'm asking you to walk it with me." The recruits exchanged glances, their expressions hardening with quiet resolve, a spark of inspiration catching in their eyes. Weeks later, the investigation bore fruit. Arrests rolled out like thunder, several individuals, including two active officers, their hands stained with evidence tying them to the ambush and a wider web of sabotage against Devon's reforms. At a press conference, the precinct steps swarmed with reporters, their microphones thrust forward like spears. Devon stood tall, his uniform impeccable, his voice a steady rumble. "This department won't shelter corruption or violence enough from outsiders, not from within. These arrests are proof we're serious about earning your trust, about keeping you safe." The community's response roared back, protests morphed into rallies, voices once raised in anger now cheering the slow, hard-won progress. One evening, Devon and Ryan returned to the park where it had all started, where they'd once shot hoops with local kids under a blazing summer sun. Now, the space thrummed with life, families sprawled on blankets, children shrieking with laughter, even off-duty officers mingling, their smiles tentative but genuine. Devon sank onto a bench, the wood creaking under his weight, his eyes tracing the scene with a quiet pride. Ryan joined him, to steaming cups of coffee in hand. "Did you ever think we'd get here?" he asked, passing one to Devon. The captain took a slow sip, the warmth seeping into his bones. "I knew it'd be a war," he said, his gaze steady. "But this makes every battle worth it." Ryan grinned, small but real. "We're finally breaking through." Devon's eyes softened, a rare glint of warmth breaking through his stoicism. "We are. And it's because of officers like you, Collinsons, who don't run when it gets tough." The work wasn't done. Devon knew that better than anyone. The department's culture was shifting, but trust didn't heal overnight. In a final address, he stood before his officers, the room silent but for the faint hum of the precinct's heartbeat. "That attack was supposed to scare us into silence," he said, his voice a quiet thunder. "Instead, it lit a fire, We owe it to ourselves, to each other, to this city, to be better. This isn't just a badge, it's a promise. Let's keep it." The applause that followed was deafening, a tide turning in real time. On the anniversary of the reforms, the precinct held a ceremony, small but potent. Devon and Ryan stood side by side, addressing a crowd of officers, citizens, kids with wide eyes. "This isn't the end," Devon said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "It's a beginning. Together, we'll keep pushing." Ryan stepped up, his tone earnest. "Every day, we choose easy or right. Let's keep choosing right." The applause rose again, a wave of purpose washing over them. Their story of courage, accountability, the raw cost of justice echoed far beyond Riverest. A reminder that power unchecked breeds ruin. But power wielded with integrity can mend even the deepest fractures. At that pivotal moment, Senator Malcolm Grant shifted his stance ever so slightly, his broad shoulders squaring toward the sea of onlookers gathered in the courthouse plaza. His voice, rich and resonant, carried over the restless hum of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone warm yet commanding, "you've all borne witness to this exchange today. You've seen with your own eyes the kind of conduct we're striving to uproot from our society. I implore you to etch this moment into your memory, to hold those in power your leaders, your guardian sacerdotal for their actions. Real change, the kind that lasts, begins with us, with every single one of you." His words ignited the air, and the crowd responded with a thunderous roar of cheers and applause, a wave of electric energy surging through the plaza like a living thing. Officer Daniel Croft stood motionless amid the uproar, his stocky frame rigid as though carved from stone. His face was a chaotic canvas of emotion. Anger flared in the tight set of his jaw. Humiliation burned red across his cheeks, and fear flickered in the slight widening of his eyes. He felt the weight of 100 gazes boring into him, each one a silent accusation. But Malcolm wasn't finished. With a deliberate turn, he faced Croft again, his towering presence shrinking the space between them. His voice dropped to a low, steely timbre, each word measured and sharp as a blade. "I suggest you step aside now, officer. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to push this further. I assure you, the cameras won't stop rolling." The threat hung there, quiet but unmistakable, a dare wrapped in calm certainty. Croft hesitated, his hand twitching near his holster as though instinct urged him to reclaim control. The crowd's fervor pressed against him, a palpable force, while the glinting lenses of countless phones captured his every move. Malcolm's unflinching stare bore into him, steady and unrelenting, a mirror reflecting Croft's unraveling composure. It was too much. With a sharp exhale, Croft relented, stepping back with a jerk, his teeth grinding so hard the sound seemed to echo in his skull. Malcolm adjusted his impeccably tailored suit jacket with a casual grace, his poise unshaken. "Thank you," he said, his voice polite but edged with a frost that sent a shiver down Croft's spine. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to attend to." With that, he turned and strode toward the courthouse steps, his every movement radiating purpose. The crowd parted like a tide, their cheers swelling as Malcolm passed, a chorus of admiration and defiance ringing out. Croft remained rooted where he stood, the ground beneath him feeling unsteady as the reality of the encounter sank into his bones. His uniform, once a source of pride, now felt like a shackle, tightening with every shout from the throng. The humiliation was far from over, it was only beginning. As Senator Malcolm Grant ascended the wide stone steps, his back straight and his head high, confidence seemed to ripple from him in waves. Below, Croft's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as he watched Malcolm disappear into the courthouse's shadow. The situation he'd thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers like sand. Around him, the crowd's murmurs sharpened into pointed barbs. "Unbelievable," a woman nearby muttered, her voice thick with disbelief as she adjusted her glasses, peering at Croft like he was a specimen under glass. "Profiling a senator in broad daylight, how shameless can you get?" A young man beside her, his phone still raised, grinned with a mix of triumph and outrage. "I've got it all right, her ethos is going viral. People need to see what's happening." Croft's ears burned as the chatter swelled, each word a fresh wound. The realization crashed over him like a cold wave. This wouldn't stay quiet. His face, flushed and contorted, was already immortalized on screens across the plaza, racing toward every corner of the internet. It wouldn't be long before his precinct captain saw it, before the entire department was dragged into a storm of scrutiny and shame. But instead of shrinking under the weight, Croft's pride flared like a cornered animal's. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, let alone dismantled so publicly. His chest heaved as he glared up at Malcolm, who now stood at the courthouse entrance, shaking hands with a cluster of officials. Their polished suits and polite smiles mocked Croft's unraveling state. Bitterness churned in his gut. How dare this man, someone he'd already dismissed in his mind as unworthy, turn the tables with such effortless precision? Fueled by a cocktail of frustration and desperation, Croft stormed up the steps, ignoring the gasps and shouts from the crowd below. "Hey!" an onlooker yelled, clutching a coffee cup as he stumbled back. What's he doing now? Croft didn't care. He reached the heavy courthouse doors just as Malcolm was about to cross the threshold, his voice slicing through the clamor like a whip. "Hold it right there." Malcolm paused mid-step, his polished shoe hovering above the marble floor. He turned slowly, his expression unruffled, though his dark eyes glinted with something sharper now. The officials around him froze to a gray-haired man in a pinstripe suit furrowed his brow, while a younger woman with a stack of files clutched them tighter, her lips parting in quiet alarm. The crowd below hushed, their phones rising once more to capture this escalating drama. Croft's face was a mask of fury, his cheeks ruddy as he jabbed a finger toward Malcolm. "I don't care who you resonator, big shot, whatever. You think you can just humiliate me out there in front of everyone and walk away like it's nothing?" Malcolm's gaze didn't waver, but a faint crease appeared at the corner of his mouth, as though he were suppressing a sigh. "Embarrass you?" he echoed, his voice soft yet piercing, each syllable deliberate. "Officer Croft, I didn't embarrass you. Your choices did that all on their own." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, and Croft flinched, his anger flaring hotter. He took a step closer, his boots scuffing the stone, his voice dropping to a guttural snarl. "Don't you dare twist this around. You made me look like a fool in front of all those people. You think that fancy title makes you untouchable?" Malcolm's eyes hardened, though his tone remained steady as steel. "No one's untouchable, officer. That's the entire point. Accountability doesn't bend for anyone for me, and certainly not for you." The air between them crackled with tension, thick and suffocating. Malcolm stood tall, his frame unyielding, while Croft's glare burned with a mix of defiance and desperation. The officials shifted uncomfortably. The gray-haired man cleared his throat, glancing toward the doors as if hoping for an escape, while the woman's knuckles whitened around her files, her breath shallow. "You've got some nerve lecturing me," Croft spat, his voice rising, jagged with resentment. "You don't know what it's like out there, putting your life on the line every day, dealing with liars, thieves, people who'd stab you in the back just to game the system." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his expression softening into something almost pensive. "And tell me, Officer Croft," he replied, his voice calm but cutting, "how exactly does that justify singling someone out because of how they look?" The question hung there, heavy and unanswerable, pinning Croft in place. His mouth opened, then closed, the retort he'd meant to hurl dissolving into silence. The moment stretched, taut and unbearable, broken only by the faint rustle of the crowd below, their whispers rising like a tide. Malcolm stepped forward, closing the scant distance between them until they were mere inches apart. His voice remained even, but it carried a weight that seemed to press against Croft's chest. "Here's what I know," he said, his gaze locking onto Croft's. "That badge you wear isn't just a decoration. It's a promise of trust, of fairness, of integrity. And when someone like you twists it into a tool for your own prejudice, you don't just tarnish yourself, you chip away at the very bedrock of justice we all depend on." Croft's face twisted, indignation warring with something deeper guilt, perhaps, though he'd never admit it. Before he could muster a response, Malcolm leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, intimate yet chilling. "And here's the kicker, officer. You didn't just target me today. You targeted everything I stand for: progress, change, a world where this kind of abuse isn't swept under the rug anymore." The words struck Croft like a physical blow, reverberating through him. He felt the stares of the officials, the crowd, the invisible millions behind those phone screens, all waiting to see how he'd claw his way out of this. But there was no way out, not this time. Malcolm straightened, his voice returning to its usual cadence, crisp and final. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. And if you've got any sense left, Officer Croft, you'll take a long, hard look at yourself before you dig this hole any deeper." With that, he turned and stepped into the courthouse. The heavy doors swinging shut behind him with a dull thud. The crowd erupted once more, their cheers rolling across the plaza like a victorious anthem. But for Croft, the sound was distant, muffled by the storm raging inside him. He stood there, fists balled at his sides, his pride in tatters, a small, unwelcome voice whispering in the back of his mind. He'd lost, and the fault was his alone. The weight of it pinned him to the steps, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His face flickered between crimson rage and a pale, ashen dread as the crowd's jubilation stabbed at his ears. People still filmed him, their phones glinting in the sunlight, their whispers weaving a net of judgment around him. He wasn't just Officer Croft anymore, it was a cautionary tale, a living emblem of the corruption Malcolm had so deftly exposed. "Excuse me," a voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, sharp yet tinged with unease. He turned to see a courthouse official, a middle-aged woman with a clipboard pressed against her chest. Like a shield, her brown eyes held a mix of pity and reprimand, as though she couldn't decide whether to console him or chastise him. "You'll need to step aside, officer," she said, her tone gentle but firm, though her grip on the clipboard tightened. "The press conference is about to start, and we can't have anyone lingering here." Croft blinked at her, momentarily dazed, his mind still reeling. "Too was just," he stammered, but she cut him off, her voice sharpening. "Harassing a state senator in front of a crowd. Yes, I saw it. We all did." Her words were a slap, and Croft bristled, his pride flaring one last time. "I was doing my job," he snapped, but the defense rang hollow even to his own ears. She raised an eyebrow, her lips thinning into a line that held back a flood of scorn. "Right?" she said, sarcasm dripping from the word. "Well, unless your job description includes burying your own career, I'd suggest you leave now. Trust me, officer, it's only going to get worse if you stay." His jaw clenched, but he had no fight left to give her. Turning away, he descended the steps, the crowd parting not out of deference but disgust. Their eyes tracked him, some narrowed in contempt, others wide with disbelief. "Is he for real?" a man muttered, his voice low but cutting. "He still thinks he's the good guy here." A woman nearby shook her head, her scarf fluttering as she whispered to her friend, "What a disgrace. And to think people like him are supposed to keep us safe." Another voice, louder, pierced the air. "I hope they fire him for this." Each comment seared into Croft like a brand. But he kept his head down, retreating to his cruiser. He yanked the door open and collapsed into the driver's seat, slamming it shut with a force that rattled the frame. For a long moment, he sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles blanched. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the chaos in his mind. Outside, the world buzzed with the consequences of his actions. Justice had spoken, loud and clear, and the cost of his arrogance was only beginning to unfold. The thundering rhythm of his heartbeat pounded relentlessly against his ribcage, a chaotic drum roll that mirrored the whirlwind tearing through his mind. How had everything spiraled so far out of control? Just that morning, Daniel Croft had risen from bed with the same unshakable certainty he always carried: his uniform, crisp, his badge gleaming, his authority a steel wall around him. He'd strode into the day convinced of his power, certain that respect was his by right, earned through years of enforcing order. But in a mere handful of minutes, Malcolm Grant had ripped that illusion to shreds, leaving Croft exposed, raw, and vulnerable before a world that now saw him for what he truly was. The sting of it burned deep, not just because of the humiliation, but because he couldn't even muster a defense. The evidence was undeniably video, sharp and unforgiving, spreading like wildfire across the internet, replaying his downfall in an endless loop. There was no clever twist he could weave, no excuse to cloak the truth. He'd been caught, his flaws laid bare, and he knew it. Yet, instead of the remorse that might have softened the blow, a searing anger roared to life within him. It consumed him, a wildfire fed by indignation. He was furious at Malcolm, the smooth-talking senator who'd turned him into a laughingstock with a few well-chosen words. He seethed at the crowd, their cheers and jeers a deafening chorus against him, as if they'd all conspired to tear him down. Most of all, he raged at himself not for what he'd done, but for letting it happen, for losing the iron grip he'd always maintained. His fist crashed against the steering wheel, the jolt of pain shooting up his arm barely a whisper compared to the tempest howling inside him. Through the streaked windshield of his patrol car, he could see the courthouse steps, where Malcolm now stood like a conquering hero behind a podium. The senator's voice carried faintly on the wind, though Croft couldn't make out the words. Cameras flashed in a frenzy, their blinding bursts illuminating Malcolm's sharp suit and sharper resolve. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, drinking in every syllable, while the crowd below erupted in waves of applause, their fervor swelling with each gesture Malcolm made his hands slicing the air with purpose, his face alight with a fire that Croft envied more than he could admit. That envy gnawed at him, a bitter, twisting thing. How could Malcolm command such devotion so effortlessly? How could he stand there, basking in adoration, while Croft sat here, stewing in the wreckage of his own making? It wasn't right, wasn't fair. But as he watched, a colder, sharper feeling slithered into his chest. Fear. What if this wasn't just a fleeting scandal? What if this moment clung to him like a shadow, dogging his every step, poisoning his career until there was nothing left? What if this was the unraveling of everything he'd built? He shook his head violently, as if he could dislodge the thoughts like loose debris. He couldn't let himself spiral, not yet. There had to be a way out, a plan to claw back control. Maybe he could paint Malcolm as the instigator, claim the senator had baited him into that confrontation. Maybe he could shift the blame, turn the tide. His mind raced, grasping for straws, when a sudden rap on the window jolted him from his reverie. He turned, startled, to find a younger officer standing beside the car. The man's face was a mask of quiet severity, jaw tight, his eyes shadowed with something that might have been pity or disdain. Croft rolled down the window with a reluctant creak, the cool air rushing in to mingle with the stale heat of his frustration. "Captain wants to see you," the officer said, his voice flat, stripped of any camaraderie. There was no need to ask which captain or why. Croft's stomach plummeted, a lead weight sinking into his gut. "Great," he muttered, the word dripping with sarcasm as he fired up the engine. The car lurched out of the parking spot, and with every turn of the wheel, the distant roar of the courthouse crowd echoed in his ears, a mocking reminder of the reckoning awaiting him. Justice, he was beginning to realize, wasn't just a word he wielded. It was a force that could turn on him, too. By the time he pulled into the precinct lot, his hands were clamped so tightly around the steering wheel that his knuckles ached. Pale and trembling, the knot in his stomach had grown into a tangled mass, tightening with every step he took toward the station's double doors. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes boring into him, his fellow officers, watching from behind the walls, their judgment already sharpening like knives. He knew what awaited inside, the hushed whispers that would trail him down the corridors, the smirks he wouldn't be able to confront, the shame that was already clawing its way up his throat. Yet his pride, that stubborn, unyielding beast, refused to let him bow his head, not to them, not to anyone. He shoved through the entrance, and the precinct fell silent, as if the air itself held its breath. Conversations stuttered to a halt mid-sentence, heads swiveling to track his path. The sound of his boots striking the tiled floor rang out like gunshots in the stillness, each step amplifying the heat rising in his cheeks. A few officers exchanged glances, their lips twitching into faint, knowing smirks, vultures circling a fresh kill. Others turned away, their eyes darting to the floor, unwilling to meet the gaze of the man who'd dragged their department's name through the mud. Croft, the voice sliced through the tension, sharp and commanding, echoing from the end of the hall. It was Captain Reynolds, his tone a whip crack that left no room for doubt. This wasn't going to be a gentle chat over coffee. "In my office." Now, Croft swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper, and forced his legs to carry him forward. Each step felt like wading through molasses, his boots heavier than they'd ever been. When he stepped into the office, Reynolds was already seated behind his desk, a towering figure despite the gray threading through his hair and the deep lines carved into his weathered face. The captain's presence filled the room, a storm cloud crackling with barely restrained fury. "Shut the door," he barked, his eyes fixed on the tablet in his hands, not even sparing Croft a glance. Croft obeyed, the soft click of the latch sounding like a gavel falling. He stood rigid before the desk, his mouth opening to speak, but Reynolds silenced him with a raised hand, his attention locked on the screen. The tinny sound of the video spilled into the room. Holmes' voice, calm and cutting, rising above the murmur of the crowd. "You could say that. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an important engagement inside." The footage rolled on, capturing Croft's bluster, his aggression, and then the moment Malcolm revealed his credentials as state senator, untouchable and poised, leaving Croft floundering in the dust. Reynolds set the tablet down with deliberate slowness, his gaze finally lifting to pin Croft in place. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he demanded, his voice a low growl, dangerous and precise. Croft opened his mouth to respond, but the captain cut him off. "Save it. I've had my fill of excuses today. That little show you put on outside the courthouse. It's everywhere, social media, news channels, you name it. Do you even grasp how bad this makes us look? How bad it makes me look?" Croft's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as frustration boiled over. "I was just doing my job," he ground out, his jaw tight. He was acting suspicious. Reynolds slammed his hands on the desk, the sound reverberating like thunder. "Suspicious? He's a state senator. Croft, suspicious, my ass. You profiled him plain and simplined. Now we're all drowning in the fallout of your idiocy." The captain's voice rose, his face reddening as he leaned forward. "The mayor's office wants a formal apology. The commissioner's on my back. The media's treating this like a feeding frenzy. This isn't just about you anymore, it's about every single one of us." Croft's cheeks burned, a volatile mix of anger and shame swirling in his chest, but he refused to yield. "With all due respect, Captain, I didn't know who he was. How was I supposed to?" "That's the point," Reynolds roared, cutting him off again. "You didn't know, but you assumed the worst. And now, thanks to you, the whole department's under a microscope. The city council's talking mandatory bias training. The public's baying for your suspension or worse. Your badge. Even the guys downstairs are calling you a liability." The word landed like a sledgehammer, cracking the image Croft had always held of himself, a respected officer, a pillar among his peers. Now that foundation was crumbling, and he could feel the shards cutting deep. Reynolds leaned back, rubbing his temples as if staving off a migraine. "Do you know how much damage control I'm facing because of you? This isn't just a slap on the wrist. Croft, this could end you." "Captain," Croft started, but Reynolds silenced him again. "You've got two choices," the captain said, his voice icy. "Option 1, you go public, apologize to Senator Grant and this city. Take full responsibility, excuses, no dodging. Option 2, I put you on unpaid suspension. Let internal affairs dig through this mess. And if it comes to that, your career is as good as dead." Croft's chest tightened, his breath shallow. Neither path spared his dignity. The thought of standing before cameras, baring his soul to a jeering public, made his stomach churn. But suspension, losing his job, after all he'd sacrificed. Reynolds sighed, his stern mask softening just a fraction. "You screwed up, Croft royally. But how you handle this now decides if you've got any shot at redemption. Think hard." Croft left the office in a daze, his mind a storm of clashing emotions as he stumbled back to his car. The weight of the ultimatum pressed down on him, a suffocating tide he couldn't escape. Sitting behind the wheel, he stared blankly at the precinct building, the echoes of Reynolds' words mingling with the texts buzzing on his phonesome, from friends offering tepid support, others from colleagues laced with venom. His wife's voice lingered too, her earlier call replaying in his head. "What were you thinking? Daniel, do you know what people are saying?" He gripped the wheel until his hands shook, his knuckles white as bone. For the first time, he felt the cracks in his armor wooden, not just from that day's disaster, but from the deeper flaws he'd never faced. Justice wasn't a tool he could bend to his will. It was a mirror, and it had turned on him at last. Power, wielded recklessly, had consequence, and as the crowd's distant cheers haunted him, he wondered if he'd ever truly understood that until now. The air inside Officer Daniel Croft's patrol car felt suffocating, heavy with the bitter tang of regret. He sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, staring out at the dim glow of a street lamp flickering in the dusk. He despised the sensation, the creeping dread of being trapped, the slow unraveling of the control he'd clung to like a lifeline. And yet, deep within the recesses of his mind, a faint, relentless whisper gnawed at him, a voice he'd spent years trying to silence. "You were wrong," it hissed, cold and unyielding. The truth it carried was a blade, slicing through the fragile armor of his self-assurance. His thoughts spiraled back to that fateful encounter with Senator Malcolm Grant outside the courthouse, replaying every excruciating detail with a clarity that stung. The memory unfolded like a slow-motion film. Malcolm standing tall, his dark suit impeccable, his posture unshaken despite the chaos swirling around him. The senator's voice had been a steady current, smooth as polished stone, cutting through the noise without ever rising above a calm cadence. He hadn't shouted, hadn't needed to. Instead, he'd dismantled Croft's actions with surgical precision, laying bare the ugly biases Croft hadn't even realized he carried. "You targeted me because you thought I was powerless," Malcolm had said, his words landing like a punch to the gut. "You assumed I couldn't defend myself." Each syllable had burrowed into Croft's chest, deeper than he'd ever admit, leaving a wound that throbbed with every heartbeat. He could still see the crowd gathered on those weathered courthouse steps, their faces a gallery of judgment, eyes narrowed in disgust, lips pursed in silent condemnation. Their stares had pinned him in place, stripping away the bravado he'd worn like a badge. And the worst part, he couldn't argue with them. Their scorn felt earned. He'd been so quick to flex his authority, so eager to assert dominance, that he hadn't paused to weigh the fallout. What if it hadn't been Malcolm standing there that day? What if it had been someone else, a Simeon without a title, without the shield of cameras and a watchful crowd? Someone defenseless, invisible to the world, who'd bear the brunt of his assumptions in silence. The thought twisted his stomach into knots, a sickening churn that made him grip the wheel tighter, as if he could squeeze the unease out of his body. For years, Croft had built a fortress around his conscience, brick by brick. He wasn't like those efficient ones splashed across headlines for brutality, the ones who became cautionary tales whispered in precinct break rooms. No, he'd told himself he was different, fair, professional, a man whose every action was rooted in justice. But now, sitting alone in the dimming light, that fortress crumbled. The cracks had been there all along, hidden beneath the surface, and for the first time, he let himself peer into them. Had he been deluding himself this whole time? Had he been just another cog in a machine that chewed up trust and spat out resentment? A sharp buzz jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. His phone rattled against the cracked vinyl of the passenger seat, its screen lighting up with a notification that made his pulse quicken. Senator Malcolm Grant addresses police reform after confrontation with officer. Against the screaming protests of his better judgment, Croft's thumb hovered over the screen, then tapped. The video loaded instantly, and there was Malcolm again, standing at a podium bathed in the golden hues of late afternoon. The courthouse loomed behind him, its stone facade a silent witness to their clash. The senator's voice flowed through the car's speakers, steady and resonant, each word carrying the weight of conviction. "This isn't just about me," he said, his gaze piercing through the lens as if he could see Croft sitting there, listening. "This is about the countless people who endure this treatment every single day, people who don't have a voice, who don't have the privilege to push back. It's about building a system where accountability isn't just a hollow promise, but a living, breathing reality." Croft's throat tightened as he watched, his breath shallow. Malcolm didn't waver, didn't falter. "We can't let bias and prejudice erode the bond between law enforcement and the communities they're sworn to protect," he continued. "And that starts with facing the truth, not burying it." The words weren't just about Croft, they were about the whole damn system that had shaped him, propped him up, and let him believe his actions were beyond reproach. Deep down, in a place he rarely dared to look, Croft knew Malcolm was right. Justice wasn't a badge you wore. It was a standard you lived up to. And he'd fallen short. The camera swept over the crowd, capturing a sea of face and tear-streaked, some defiant-folding signs that demanded accountability now and end racial profiling. Their cheers roared through the speakers, a thunderous wave of approval that drowned out the static in Croft's mind. For a fleeting moment, he pictured himself in Malcolm's place, basking in that admiration, his chest swelling with the pride of doing right. But the fantasy dissolved as quickly as it came. He remembered his own stance on those steps, arms crossed, jaw clenched, defiance radiating from him like heat off asphalt. The contrast was stark, and it left him hollow. The video faded to black, and Croft sat motionless, the silence pressing against his eardrums. His mind drifted to Captain Reynolds, the grizzled veteran who'd sat him down earlier that day in a cramped office. That smelled of stale coffee and regret. Reynolds had laid it out plain. Croft had to pause. He could publicly apologize to Malcolm, laying his pride bare before the city, owning up to the biases he'd ignored for years. Or he could face suspension, an investigation, and the slow, inevitable collapse of the career he'd spent decades building. Neither option felt like salvation, but the second was a death sentence he couldn't stomach. With a ragged breath that scraped his lungs, Croft reached for his phone again. His fingers trembled as he scrolled to a number he'd never imagined dialing, a number tied to a man he'd wronged in a way that couldn't be undone with excuses. The line rang once, twice, 3 times, each tone stretching into eternity. Then that voice, calm, familiar, unshakable. "This is Senator Malcolm Grant." Croft froze, his pride clawing at him, urging him to hang up and retreat into the safety of denial. But something stronger pushed through, a fragile thread of clarity he couldn't ignore. "Senator Grant," he said, his voice a low rumble, barely above a whisper. "This is Officer Daniel Croft. I think we need to talk." The pause on the other end stretched taut, and Croft's heart thudded against his ribs. Would Malcolm dismiss him? Had he already burned that bridge to ash? But then came the reply. "Steady as ever, I'm listening, officer." Days later, Croft found himself in a small conference room at City Hall, the air thick with tension that clung to his skin like damp cloth. Across a scratched wooden table sat Malcolm, his presence as composed and commanding as it had been on those courthouse steps. The room was bare of faded beige walls, a single flickering fluorescent light overhead, but the weight of what was about to unfold made it feel like a pressure cooker. They were alone, yet the stakes loomed larger than the space could hold. When Croft had made that call, Malcolm had agreed to meet, but with a condition that struck like a gavel. The conversation had to be public. "Accountability requires transparency," he'd said over the phone, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Now, in less than 10 minutes, Croft would face a press conference live on local TV, with reporters, activists, and a city full of onlookers waiting to hear him bare his soul. Malcolm broke the silence first, his voice cutting through the stifling air. "You wanted to talk. Officer, here's your chance." His eyes locked onto Croft's, steady and unflinching, a mirror that reflected every flaw Croft had tried to hide. For a heartbeat, Croft's instinct screamed at him to deflect or blame the crowd's pressure, the media's spin, even Malcolm's poise for escalating the situation. But under that gaze, the excuses withered. He clasped his hands tighter, the skin stretching white over his knuckles, and forced the words out. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot, "for what happened outside the courthouse." Malcolm didn't react, his face a mask of calm neutrality. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant, pressing down on Croft until he squirmed in his seat. "I was wrong," he pushed on, the admission trembling on his tongue. "I let my assumptions take over. I didn't treat you fairly, not you, and not the people I'm supposed to serve." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as if peering into Croft's soul. "Do you understand why what you did was wrong?" he asked, his tone firm but measured. A teacher probing a reluctant student. Croft swallowed hard, the lump in his throat sharp as broken glass. "Because I judged you by how you looked," he said, the words clawing their way out. "I assumed you didn't belong because of your skin color." Saying it aloud felt like shedding a layer of himself, raw and painful, yet oddly freeing. He dropped his gaze to the table, tracing the scratches in the wood with his eyes, unable to face Malcolm's scrutiny. "I've been replaying it over and over these past few days," he admitted. "How I let those biases drive me. And it's not the first time. There've been other moments, smaller ones that didn't make the news, but they were wrong too. All of it." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his posture easing just enough to hint at something softer, maybe understanding, maybe a flicker of hope. "Recognizing the problem is where it starts," he said, his voice low but resonant. "But it's only the beginning." Croft nodded quickly, seizing the lifeline. "I know. I want to do, but Terry need to. I'm not here begging for forgiveness, he haven't earned that. But I'm ready to own this, whatever it takes." For the first time, Malcolm's expression shifted, a trace of warmth breaking through the stern facade. "Owning it means more than words, officer," he said. "It's about real change for you, and for the system that let this happen." "I'll do it," Croft replied, his voice steadier now. "Bias training, community work, hell, I'll start from scratch if that's what it takes." Malcolm studied him, his gaze lingering as if weighing the sincerity behind the words. Then he stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor. "Words matter," he said, "but actions carry the weight. If you mean this, you'll get your chance to show it." Croft rose too, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I won't let you down," he said quietly, "or the people I've hurt." Malcolm gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Good. Let's start today." A sharp knock echoed through the room, a signal from beyond the door that the moment had arrived. Together, they stepped out into the press room, where the air buzzed with anticipation. Reporters lined the walls, their cameras clicking like a swarm of insects, microphones bristling around a podium that stood like a judge's bench. The crowd hummed with restless energy, activists clutching notebooks, onlookers craning their necks, the faint rustle of protest signs tucked under arms. Malcolm took the stage first, his presence filling the room like a quiet storm. He spoke of accountability, of the incident as a symptom of a deeper rot, but also of the possibility for redemption if people dared to face their failings head-on. His words were a call to arms, delivered with a grace that left the room hanging on every breath. Then it was Croft's turn. He approached the podium, his palms slick with sweat, his legs heavy as if wading through mud. The cameras zoomed in, their lenses glinting like predators' eyes, catching the sheen of perspiration on his brow. He gripped the podium's edges, his fingers digging into the wood, and cleared his throat. "My name's Officer Daniel Croft," he began, his voice rough but firm. "And I'm here to own up to what I did." The room fell silent, a hush so thick it pressed against his eardrums. "I screwed up," he said, the words blunt and unpolished. "I let assumptions guide me, and I treated Senator Grant wrong. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't just. I take full responsibility for that." He paused, glancing at Malcolm, who offered a subtle note, a lifeline in the storm. "This has opened my eyes," Croft went on. "I'm not perfect, but I'm committed to learning from this, to being the kind of cop this city deserves. An apology's just the start, I know that. But I'm here to promise you I'll put in the work, for myself and for everyone I've let down." The room erupted, camera shutters snapping, voices murmuring, a chaotic symphony of reaction. Croft stepped back, his chest heaving, feeling raw and exposed, but also lighter, as if a weight he'd carried too long had begun to lift. Malcolm moved forward, extending a hand. Croft took it, their grip firm and brief. But the image burned into the Lancesa senator and an officer, standing together in a fragile truce. It was a symbol, a quiet promise that justice could prevail if power faced its consequences. As the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, Croft lingered, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. The road ahead was long, treacherous even, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk it.